Chapter 1232. Aina's fragrance lingered in the air. Even when Lionel couldn't seem to hear or see anything else, this scent alone was imprinted onto his mind and engraved into his very being. He remembered this scent well. A cross of apple and just the slightest hint of cinnamon. The only way to get the perfect profile of this smell was to use the force herbs he had planted so many of in the segmented cube. But the segmented cube had obviously been with him this entire time, so the only way this would have worked was if she took it with her. Lionel hadn't been to that garden since Aina left. For all he knew, all those force herbs had died, or maybe there wasn't any of them left at all. Scent was probably the sense most capable of triggering memories, and not only that, but it was intertwined with emotion so deeply that they couldn't be divorced from one another. What Lionel did know was that this smell had most definitely not been on Aina that day, or else even with all the foolish rage in the world, he might not have been able to speak those words. What Lionel didn't know was that Aina had only taken a single flower with her, feeling too guilty to justify any more. She had kept it with her all this time and managed to convince herself to finally use it over a year later for this very moment. Lionel's gaze slowly regained its focus, looking down at the amethyst token in his hand. His heart didn't feel the heaviness at all. In fact, even though his hand felt as though it might fall through the earth at any moment, his heart felt as light as a feather and his gaze was as calm as a lake surface. Aina handed him this token. What did it mean? Lionel felt that it was quite clear. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. She spoke of leading the sector, but the momentum in her gaze was far deeper and vaster than that. She gave Lionel this token, telling him that he needed it more than she did, because she knew of his goal. How could the future king of the dimensional verse be subservient to another? Even in his first step toward glory, he should always be at the front, his back in full view of everyone else. Lionel's foot trembled slightly and he seemed to vanish. In an upswell of wind, he landed on the arena just as Aina made it to the seating arrangements of the people of Earth. She smiled gracefully, even bowing her head slightly. Too many were too speechless to say a thing, but Roja didn't seem to miss a beat. "Sweet child, come sit next to Grandma." Roja brought Aina to her side before she could protest, wrapping her arms around hers. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, Meal watched this scene with a dark expression, but there was already nothing else he could do about it. It seemed that his daughter had made her decision, and as furious as he was helpless. Lionel seemed to sense a dense murderous intent that wasn't coming from Miguel at all. His gaze shifted from the amethyst token, sifting through the crowd until it landed on a familiar man, the very man who had almost blown his head to bits with a single punch. His expression didn't change much, nor was there any rage in it. He didn't seem to be angry with Meal at all. In fact, maybe he was a bit thankful. Who knows what else he might have said had he not been snapped out of that state. With a flip of his palm, the amethyst token vanished and a light breath left Lionel's lips. Something about his disposition shifted and the stone beneath his bare feet creaked and whined almost as though his weight had increased tenfold. When he finally looked up to meet Miguel's gaze, the latter was looking back, unmoved. Even after being forcefully teleported to the stage and even after learning of who Lionel's mother was, the needle hadn't budged for him. His expression was even more indifferent than Lionel's own. In fact, there was no coldness either, just a blank wall anything could be painted on. Even after all this time, Lionel couldn't quite get a read on Miguel, at least not as easily as he could seem to grasp others. He was a man of few words and he didn't display any outward emotions. He was about as difficult to read as Lionel would say he was. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, however, Lionel felt he knew enough. This was a young man who sought nothing more than power. He was decisive and unfeeling. He did things at his greatest convenience and didn't care about what harm he caused otherwise. He didn't feel shame not because he couldn't, but rather because he felt he had never done anything shameful. The words and opinions of others were meaningless to him, all that mattered was his own. Lionel knew quite a bit, enough that it was odd that he would say that he still didn't quite have a read on Miguel. But he had his own reasons for saying so. There was a silent lull that took place, a gentle gliding wind riding the silence at an unhurried pace. Orinik didn't dare to start an event that Alienor had proposed, so he sat in silence, feeling that if this was the case, the battle could be considered to have already started. As for the amethyst token in Lionel's hand, he chose not to say a single word about it. Suddenly, the two vanished. The sound of stone meeting stone and metal crashing against metal resounded through the skies 3 times, 3 sonic booms and wild outflows of wind jetting forth in their wake. A moment later, Lionel and Miguel appeared where they had always been, the only difference being the turbulent wind around them. Visit. For a better user experience, Miguel was entirely unmoved by an almost blinding streak of scarlet that fell from the corner of Lionel's lips. You are weak, Miguel said plainly. Chapter 1233. Lionel wiped at his blood with a thumb, rolling his shoulders back until he heard a satisfying crack. Beside himself, he released a yawn, stretching his neck from side to side. It seems he was still a bit tired from yesterday, but that couldn't be helped. As for Miguel's words, they were probably true. At least in that exchange, he really was the weaker of the two. The envoys of Void Palace couldn't help but frown. The wielder of an amethyst token bleeding was something that had never happened since its inception. Or, more accurately, one had never bled during their selection. The entire point of the amethyst token was to represent invincibility, and Lionel was decidedly not that. The rest had dismissed his battle with Isaac, thinking that he was just fooling around. After all, Lionel was a spearman, not a bowman. This made perfect sense considering which family he came from as well. But this was getting harder and harder to accept. It didn't matter that Lionel was in Tier 4 while his opponent was a half step from the 6th dimension. Invincibility was invincibility. You either were or you weren't. There were no technicalities in real life. Lionel, though, didn't seem to care about the opinions of others. He was just a bit intrigued that Miguel had actually spoken. Oh. Is that a justification? Lionel smiled. Justification? Why would I need something like that? Oh ho. Lionel chuckled. That's not a bad response. Indeed, why would you? And here I thought you were caught up in a few words written long before you were born. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Whether those words have anything to do with me or not is meaningless. If they have nothing to do with me, I will force them to change their minds. If I have no fate with them regardless, then so what? Do I need the legacy of a fool who can't see straight? Lionel erupted into laughter when he heard these words. With each bellow, a stronger and denser violet fog seemed to waft out from him. Beneath its presence, the world itself seemed to slow. I really want to see what expressions that indifferent face of yours can make in defeat. I've never lost a battle in my life, and the first most definitely won't be to you. The two shot forward in unison. This time, they took no care to hold back, the entire platform shattering. A surge of cracks raced toward each other from opposite sides of the stage, following the wake of the two young men as though they were speeding to catch up. Bang! Lionel's forearm collided with Miguel's own, the cracks finally catching up to them as they hung in the air for just a fraction of a moment. The ground beneath them sunk and collapsed, forming a pit gained depth before blasting outward and blowing even the surrounding stages to smithereens. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience with a single tap of her foot, Alienor surrounded the entire region in a familiar golden glow, saving the audience from another potential horror story. Lionel and Miguel didn't miss a beat. Even as they fell from the skies, their knees and elbows clashed, each boom resonating like the collapse of a mountain. With every collision, Lionel felt his internal organs shake and quake. The gap in their strength was undeniable and the penetrative power of Miguel's force was deep and immeasurable. Not only was his strength beyond Lionel's, but his application of it was in another world. However, the smile on Lionel's face became a grin, and that grin quickly became a fiendish spread of pearly whites that seemed to radiate a light of its own. In that moment, bronze runes raced into existence around his skin, a crown marking his forehead and a halo hovering above his head. Bang! The next collision of their knees sounded like metal meeting metal, their elbows clashing soon after to sound like hammer meeting anvil. The two crashed onto the ground, Miguel's body suddenly erupting with a mysterious golden-white force that twinkled as though tiny crystals were falling within it. The moment Lionel landed collided with him again, it was as though he had gained 10 layers of armor. Miguel was as unmovable as a mountain. His strikes were sharp and decisive, and though not as fast as one would expect from a Luxnix, it carried an overbearing quality to it that made one feel as though a giant was stomping down on you from above. This sort of momentum alone was enough to make most fall into despair. It filled you with the kind of emotion that made you feel small and insignificant, like a speck of dust among the stars or a drop of water amidst the ocean. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, however, something about it only made Lionel fight back harder. As though he couldn't feel the pain of his limbs and fists crashing against an immovable wall, he collided with it again and again, his movements becoming faster and faster as he seemed to release everything he had. Miguel looked like a deity, his golden hair hanging in the air unaffected by its surroundings, his fists and kicks jetting out while his torso seemed unmoved and unhurried. Even his gaze didn't flicker as he met Lionel's onslaught, almost as though he was watching a toddler put together their final tantrum. Lament. The word came out of nowhere, and yet the strike that followed behind it was unlike any that came before. A mysterious energy layered Miguel's fist, his strength crashing toward Lionel like a fall meteor. Lionel's gaze flickered, his own fist jetting outward, wrapped by universal force he had been holding back on all this time. Bang! Lionel felt his arm threaten to collapse, his feet leaving 2 trenches in his wake as he shot backward. Overwhelm. Miguel didn't move from his spot, he didn't feel like he had to. 1 meter, tens of meters, it didn't matter. When he spoke, the world listened. Visit. For a better_user experience, a second fist surged forward, the air snapping and cracking as sparks of fire formed beneath the sheer speed of the strike alone. Lionel's pupils constricted. This strike was at least 10 times the strength of the last, he had no chance to block this with his fists. Chapter 1234. Bang! A pillar of smoke rose in the air, the ground combusting as though an explosive had been hidden within. But, just as quickly as Miguel's strike landed, the mighty roar of a bear resounded. The smoke and dust plumes were forcefully disrupted, a concentrated beam of light jetting outward like a laser, relentlessly piercing through the skies as though it might split anything in its path in two. In that moment, a 10-meter-tall bear rose up on its hind legs. Beneath the dispersed smoke, its aura towered and its strength pulsed in all directions, not much unlike its roar. Even the ground itself seemed to want to submit. The bear was both illusory and not, its body covered from head to toe in resplendent golden fur and its eyes shimmering like stars that held the depth of the universe. However, while its body itself seemed ethereal and unreal, on top of it was an armor of dense gray, so heavy that what remained of the stone beneath the bear cracked and shattered further. Without hesitation, the bear charged after the beam of light, following after it with a tremendous momentum. Lionel trailed its back, much of his figure hidden behind the enormous beast construct, but his gaze had become cold and focused, his fiendish grin giving way to a calculating light. Miguel, of course, recognized the bear construct. But, he had never seen it appear with armor. In just a moment, he could tell that Lionel had fused the Luxnix Force Art system with another. Even after realizing this though, he didn't spare any thought toward being impressed, nor did his expression fluctuate. His palm flipped over, a sword as light as a feather and as thin as a finger appearing in his hand. Visit. For a better_user experience, the moment it did, his whole demeanor seemed to change. His indifferent expression, unmoved by the world even if the moon fell from the skies, gained a bit of haughtiness between his brows. An arrogance that had been buried deep within his bones blossomed like a blooming flower, his first hint of an expression shining forth. The individuals of the Luxnix watched on with widened eyes. They hadn't seen Miguel use his sword against a member of his generation since he was 10 years old. No, that wasn't accurate. Those like Elodie and Siller were technically a part of Lionel's mother's generation. The truth was that Miguel had never used his sword against a member of his generation, and he hadn't used it against the generation plus one his senior since he was a child. Miguel's sword pierced forward. It seemed to carry no momentum with it, no forcefulness or power. In fact, it could only be said to be beautiful and elegant, the kind of strike that looked pretty in a practice book and could be expounded upon in a painting, but lacked the foundation of comprehension and strength it should have had. Or so it seemed. The beam of light separated into two beneath Miguel's sword as though it was nothing more than a dying flame's final twinkle. It split past his shoulders, continuing toward the barriers in the distance where it seemed to have lost all of its momentum. And yet... bang! The barriers shuddered and threatened to collapse. The power behind it was so great that the arena itself shook and quaked, the rustling of the pillars that held it up making a few cowards feel as though they should prepare to run. However, for everyone else, they couldn't seem to take their eyes off of what they were seeing for even a moment. The elegant stroke of Miguel's sword didn't lose momentum in the slightest. He only took a single step forward, and yet he seemed to appear dozens of meters away in the next instant. The latest _AP_SODIs are on _the website. The final roar of the bear construct resounded, and it even sounded somewhat sad, its body collapsing into two pieces before vanishing into sparkling motes of light. Lionel, who had been following very closely behind, narrowed his gaze. He had indeed fused the Luxnix force arts with another. He had used fourth-dimensional star core, which he could produce with ease thanks to his metal body, and then strengthened it with Camelot's magic system to form a new defensive mage art. And yet it was split in just a single strike. Even with the coldness of his gaze now, a flicker of rouge couldn't help but manifest as his heartbeat grew steadier and deeper. In that moment, his fiendish grin almost returned. In a blink, Miguel and Lionel appeared before one another. Just when it seemed that Lionel would suffer the same fate as the beam of light and the bear construct before him, his aura bloomed, the temperature plummeting as a spear of black ice appeared in his hands. Lionel didn't hold back for even a moment, his level 2 spear force bursting forth and a blinding golden spear splitting the crown on his forehead in two. Oranic's expression changed wildly when he saw this. A seventh heir? The shock even overshadowed the fact Lionel had had level 2 spear force from the very beginning. Bang! Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience spear and sword met. A wild crackling of ice and a plummeting temperature appearing to one side, and on the other a blazing golden white light shimmering with falling gems. The two shot backward beneath their opponent's strength, but just as quickly as their feet landed, they sprung forward with an even faster pace. Spear and sword left afterimages in the air, the collision of blades, light, ice and force feeling like a fireworks ceremony of untouchable proportions. Miguel's level 2 sword force vibrated wildly. His speed touched another level as he swapped between techniques of the Luxnix as though he was doing nothing more than breathing. He didn't even seem to have trouble interrupting his technique midway to switch to another, countering Lionel's spear play at every corner. Lionel's gaze almost seemed to rage with a ring of gold and crimson, the spear domain lineage factor's mark on his forehead growing in brightness with each passing moment. Miguel retrieved his sword, the arrogance between his brows only growing. Divide. His voice was layered and almost seemed like a fusion of a god and devil, commanding the world to yield beneath its call. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, Lionel didn't take a single step back, the raging violet aura around him growing in size to the point a miniature humanoid figure appeared before his head. Dragon's Might. Bang. Chapter 1235. Shirring. Shirring. Shying. Shying. The sound of sharpening blades rang out in all directions. In that moment, a strong inner will pulsed, fusing into the surroundings and making the air feel several times heavier than it had in the past. Lionel's spear pulled back and drew an arc upward through the air. It moved so quickly that a streak of blackish blue was all anyone could seem to see, the strength of his level 2 spear force multiplying several times over in the blink of an eye. Miguel didn't miss a beat, activating in almost the same instant Lionel had. Despite the fragile look of his blade, it clashed with Lionel's almost demonic spear without losing ground. Miguel found that the strength of his words had dampened the moment that small violet humanoid figure appeared. It was as though his will was clashing with Lionel's, canceling each other out. This was the first time Miguel had ever experienced someone nullifying his words, and for yet another first time, his gaze couldn't help but narrow. Suddenly, Miguel shifted, retrieving his sword and guarding it against his body as though to take on a fencing stance. His free hand pressed his fore and middle fingers together, the odd white-gold precipitating crystal force around him concentrating toward the tips of those two digits. Instead of pursuing, Lionel's dream force surged, the halo above his head pulsing as though it had a mind of its own. A violent upswell of force surged out in all directions, splitting the battlefield into two sides surrounded by a tornado of rotating winds. On one side, four silver pillars rose up from the earth, depictions of battles and grandeur etched onto their surfaces. Beneath its presence, it felt as though space itself had been frozen, as though it could be paused, undone, flattened and lengthened at the behest of Lionel. There was no doubt that after fusing with his divine armor, Lionel's space affinity had taken another enormous leap forward. In fact, due to the evolution his mother had granted him, even six-dimensional space bent to his whims. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. On the other side, the sparkling droplets of crystal that had surrounded seemed to quickly gather, sticking to one another and quickly growing in size beneath the strength of a mysterious command. It was a sight that was objectively gorgeous, but it only became more when Miguel's free hand trembled, a final twinkle of light breathing life into the gems that fell around him. In that moment, dozens of crystal wolves formed on the ground and dozens more crystal hawks took over the skies. It felt almost impossible to catch them with the naked eye unless the sun's rays hit them just right, but when they did, a beautiful sight one could hardly match was seen. All this time, the crowd had been on the edge of their seats, not having been prepared for the kind of battle they would witness today. But this scene made them all gasp in admiration in one moment, then feel their hearts seize in the next. Those that were sharper felt the danger force their small hairs to stand up. These beast constructs made Lionel's previous formulations feel like nothing more than child's play. Each and every single one of them had the strength of the sixth dimension. Lionel's gaze narrowed from within his. It seems that his speculations were correct. The root or the power source that gave the Luxnix force art system its lifelike characteristics wasn't entirely related to the language itself, but also in the uniqueness of Snow Force. It was only when incorporating it that it could show its full strength, something that naturally happened since Snow Force had a positive impact on Soul Force and internal sight. The problem, then, became obvious. Miguel had stepped beyond Snow Force, but his Luxnix force arts likewise gained an enormous boost along with it. Lionel had been so worried about what a lack of techniques would look like if he abandoned the snowy star owl that he hadn't realized that it was all already right under his nose. The crystal beast constructs shot forward. Their speed was far beyond what Miguel could muster and they had already appeared before Lionel's barrier in the blink of an eye. Miguel stood straight tall, his sword wielding had pressed to his chance as he entered a perfect stance. In that moment, his energy began to gather, his strength slowly accumulating. Even to this point, Miguel hadn't suffered a single injury. His body seemed to still be warming up to the battle, almost as though it didn't feel like it was necessary to snap itself fully away. Even the arrogance between Miguel's brows was only very slowly becoming more prominent. It felt like his true face was only now beginning to be shown to the world and everything else was nothing more than an elaborate facade. The howl of the wolves resounded as they pounced toward Lionel's barrier. Bang! 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 Lionel's pupils constricted. For the first time, cracks appeared and began to race about his like spider webs. He had always known that there was a limit to just how much pressure his self-created mage art could take, but he was still astonished by this. This was just a few of Miguel's beast constructs. What if he had attacked personally instead? The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Lionel didn't linger on these thoughts for long, his force surging as the cracks mended. In that moment, the barrier began to bulge, numerous bubbles appearing as he formed one after another, each attached with its own law. They shot outward. Before the beast constructs could react, they found themselves being enveloped by the violet-hued spears. Just like that, they lost their connection with Miguel, becoming nothing more than piles of useless gems. Lionel's palm closed into a fist, crushing them to ash. The skies, it felt as though everything had fallen into darkness. It was the kind of shift that made one feel as though a natural phenomenon was descending, the kind that commanded the attention of all. Lionel had just not been among them because the beast constructs was something he knew he had to deal with first, even knowing that Miguel was preparing something. But, when he saw it, Lionel's gaze pervaded with a piercing coldness. Up above, the high sun had completely vanished, replaced by a blanket of darkness. The first of the universal cycles was the Four Seasons realm. This first stage embodied the call of the seasons, leaving its four pillars up the interpretation of the masses. The second universal cycle was the heavenly body realm. This second embodied the rotation of the celestial behemoths that called the skies home. It touched upon the artistic conception that gave them their beauty and unique character. The third universal cycle was the natural light realm. The birth of dawn, the brightness of day, the decline of dusk, and the darkness of night. It didn't take Lionel long to realize that Miguel had grasped a night comprehension for his sword. Everything felt so all-encompassing and grand, even to the point of blanketing the entire arena in black. Lionel hadn't even grasped the heavenly body realm yet, but he was facing someone who had grasped night with his sword. Lionel had never understood why the natural light realm existed beyond the Four Seasons and heavenly body realm. It felt like it should have been the very first he came to understand. There were only more of these inconsistencies lingering beyond, and this was the honest reason why he had never been able to step beyond it. After the natural light realm came the cosmos realm, which was divided into comprehension of the galaxy, sector, domain, and universe. This seemed like it somewhat made sense, at least in this case. The cosmos was indeed beyond the seasons and the heavenly bodies. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. But right after that came the pinnacle of universal force. The constellation realm? In this realm, one would create 4 constellation pillars for yourself, each representing a different portion of your strength. That sounded all well and good, but how the hell was a constellation beyond the cosmos? For Lionel, who liked to have a logical progress to everything, and a solid understanding of everything he grasped, it threw his mind for a loop, resulting in him stagnating in the Four Seasons realm for so long. If he had a choice in the matter, it would be natural light realm, then Four Seasons realm, then heavenly body realm, followed by the constellation realm and finally the cosmos realm. That all made so much more sense. So what the hell was this? Lionel shook his head. He seemed to have completely forgotten that he was in battle and currently facing an attack powered by the artistic conception of the 6th dimension. However, Miguel didn't seem to have forgotten at all. Who knew how everyone would react if they knew what was going on in Lionel's mind right this moment? The dichotomy of light and darkness seemed to play for Miguel exceptionally well, his own brightness only being accentuated. Lionel's gaze somewhat regained their focus, his mind still feeling dissatisfied. Maybe he should grill the old bastard about it. From darkness comes light. Shroud the world and multiply my might. Miguel raised his sword high in the skies, it trembling slightly beneath the accumulating force. A blinding light divided the night as Miguel's sword fell. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. And, sorry everyone, just one chapter today, sad face. Chapter 1236. Lionel could feel the artistic conception behind Miguel's strike just as clearly as he could see the scythe of force blazing toward him. It was as though something about Miguel's comprehension had a breath of life of its own, whispering into the ears of all who saw it. Of course, this wasn't out of the kindness of its heart. Rather, it was due to an inborn arrogance, the kind that refused to allow itself to be unknown and ignored. The roar of force was deafening, and as everything else fell to darkness, it was the one and only source of light. Lionel's lip couldn't help but curl. Faced with such an unbridled haughtiness, the hidden foundation of his own persona that silently fueled his every action and thought seemed to have been stirred. For Miguel to make it seem like he was the only source of light in this world before him. How arrogant could you get? Kinetic domain. Lionel's hair whipped about wildly, its short strands moving about like they had minds of their own. The dense violet aura around him only grew denser, the subtle purple color of his barriers thickening to the point it was almost impossible to see anything other than the outline of Lionel's figure through them. The force in the surroundings seemed to have been quelled beneath Lionel's forcefulness, but the gap was simply too large. Kinetic domain was built on the foundation of a quasi-silver spear, making it a half-step from the sixth dimension. However, the universal force Miguel was using was fueled by a sixth-dimensional comprehension. The difference was enormous. But visit. For a better user experience, Lionel was also ready for this. Miguel's weakened by as much as 20%, this energy being snatched away by Lionel. With a single stomp forward, Lionel's figure forced the arena to quake. The four pillars that surrounded him only glowed with a fiercer light, so brightly, in fact, that they seemed to blend into one, making it go almost completely unnoticed when two of them vanished from thin air. Lionel took another heavy stomp forward, his legs crossing the violet barrier before him, but his figure so shrouded by light that it was only possible to notice with exceptional internal sight. But, even then, the trouble was that any attempt to do so felt like throwing a rock into an ocean. With Lionel's greater comprehension of internal sight thanks to his study of the Luxnick's manipulation techniques, he had a deeper appreciation for exactly what it was. Ultimately, internal sight was just an outward projection of soul force, and even more fundamentally, was just a blanket of energy. In that case, why wouldn't his kinetic domain swallow it up as well? All anyone could see to focus on was the collision of two blinding lights. So, when they suddenly found Lionel appearing just a single meter away from Miguel's figure, his spear raised high in the air and his force having reached its peak, their eyes couldn't help but widen. Miguel had only just unleashed a powerful strike it seemed to have taken a few seconds for him to cast. It was impossible to prepare a defense so quickly. Also, they couldn't wrap their heads around just how Lionel had done it. Teleporting past such an attack wasn't child's play. If that was possible, Space Force would be ranked even higher than it was, and those that wielded it would be invincible. Visit. For a better user experience, the more force density an environment has, the more difficult it is to use Space Force. Even the likes of the Radix family, far inferior to Miguel and the Luxnicks, were able to take advantage of this principle to make Lionel's teleportation abilities useless. The higher the quality of the force, the more difficult it became. In addition, the more volatile and unpredictable the force, the greater the unpredictability of teleportation as well. This was all to say that when Miguel prepared an attack with six-dimensional strength like he just had, teleporting even in the general vicinity should have been almost impossible, especially for a fifth-dimensional existence like Lionel. But the fact Lionel had not only done so, but he had even teleported directly through the line of attack, appearing right in front of Miguel. It was a feat extraordinary to a degree that was almost impossible to describe. However, what happened next was somehow even more baffling. Miguel's gaze narrowed, his free hand already gathering his odd white gold gem-like force again. But he had only just began when his pupils constricted, the hairs on the back of his neck rising. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Under the astonished eyes of the public, two blinding pillars rose to Miguel's back, their violet barrier twinkling for just a moment. In that instant, Miguel's attack collided with Lionel's other barrier, the sound of space whining and groaning feeling like a fork scraping against the bottom of a pot. Bang! The barrier shattered. But Miguel's blade force had also vanished into thin air. For all but a single moment. A second bang resounded. This one, however, was right behind Miguel. To his front, Lionel's spear descended, the coldness in the latter's eyes carrying with it an intent that wouldn't be denied, the kind of intent that seemed to match and then overshadow Miguel's own as though it had had its dignity challenged. To his back, an attack of his own design assaulted him. It had dimmed considerably from the first time he had levied it, but that didn't seem to matter given the situation. He had just deployed his force, he couldn't do so again so quickly and easily, and any attack he did form would be far too flimsy. Lionel's spear fell, fueled by a portion of Miguel's own strength. His calculation was perfect and without flaw, even down to the landing location of Miguel's own strike. He would end this right here. Visit. For a better user experience, bang. Bang. The cacophonic booms of the landed attack resonated throughout the arena, its entire foundation sinking down by what felt like an entire meter. Chapter 1237. The experts in the crowd found their hearts skipping a beat. Redirecting attacks using space force, teleporting them through space and changing their trajectory was so by far and away more difficult than simply teleporting through volatile force that it could only be labeled as impossible. Being able to perfectly reflect attacks, even, was so difficult that it took one being a savant like Candle to be able to do it. Lionel had redirected attacks before against the oceanic beasts of Earth. But they had been so much weaker than him to begin with that the two feats couldn't even be compared. If a sixth-dimensional expert wanted to reflect the attack of a fifth-dimensional one, it was a matter of a wave of a palm. They were essentially a god to a mortal to begin with. However, doing so with an attack at, or even worse, above your level like Lionel had was so unfathomable that if it wasn't for the resonating booms, the entire arena would have fallen into complete silence. The expressions of those of the Luxniks were incredibly ugly. The truth was that after seeing Aliénor's strength, they realized just how ignorant they had been. They had all been aware that she was still within the sixth dimension, so they never thought too much of her strength. This wasn't too surprising. Earth had only completed its metamorphosis about 5 years ago, so when Aliénor blossomed to her true strength, the Luxniks had already concluded what they believed her limits were and had no idea just how vastly she had improved. They had no idea how large the gap between two individuals of the same dimension could be. It only made matters worse that Wise Star Order, their most respected ancestor, had chosen Lionel's side to begin with and now even seemed to have been enslaved by Rija's branch of the family. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, the Starry Order elders of the family already understood that they had lost this battle, but it was hard to just shift their mentalities after decades of placing their hope in just one young man. Many of them still hoped that Miguel would win, even if it wasn't logical. They were human, after all. Seeing such a scene before them, it was difficult to accept. But maybe luckily for them, they weren't the only ones with a frown on their faces at this moment. Because oddly enough, Lionel himself was among them. Lionel held onto his spear firmly, it bowing beneath his strength. Compared to its usual black ice form, it was currently smoldering and filled with an unbridled heat that scorched even the air. But it was also precisely because of this that the fog and plumes of smoke took so long to clear. And when it did, Lionel's gaze couldn't help but narrow further. Just about 10 meters away from Lionel, Miguel seemed to be in a sorry state. His untouched robes had been torn to shreds, leaving barely enough to cover his decency. However, that was all. Miguel's skin shimmered like it was carved of crystal. There was a hint of blood at the corner of his lips and several cracks across his body, but he still rose slowly from the ground, a light cough leaving him. The haughtiness between his brows seemed to have undergone an evolution. It was so pronounced and clear that it almost felt like one was looking at a completely different person. From indifferent, standoffish, and cold, Miguel was only a blinding chain of precious metals away from looking every bit the part of a lifelong gangster. Miguel ripped the top of his robes away from himself, spitting out the mouthful of blood that was accumulating on his tongue. The cracks that ran along his toned body slowly fused and vanished one by one, the thumping of his heart suddenly treating his body like an instrument to project outward. The latest _AP_SODIes are on _the website. The beating resonated with the crystal that coated him, vibrating his body to a special frequency that pulled at the heart. Lionel could see at a glance that Miguel wasn't just arrogant, he was also a bit of a madman who happened to also be extraordinarily hard-working. Not everyone could just swallow metals and end up with a physique like Lionel's, especially for Miguel, who was born with the snowy star owl lineage factor that wasn't known for its robust body to begin with. Every line of muscle, every inch of definition, every outlined striation and pulsing vein, was the result of his own meticulous work. And it seemed that Lionel had finally knocked him awake. Miguel rose his palms to his hair, running his fingers through it and slicking it back. His actions were slow and didn't seem very special, but the oppressive aura he was giving off only seemed to grow as the thumping of his heart grew louder and louder. By a certain point, it no longer sounded like the steady beat of an organ but had rather become a thrumming war drum, the gems that coated his body becoming thicker and thicker. Miguel threw a glance toward his thin sword. It had fallen a pace before him and was so deeply entrenched into the ground that only the hilt was visible. With a wave of his palm, the sword flew to Miguel's hand. One would have thought that he had done so for the purpose of battle, but what he actually used it for was nothing short of jarring. Miguel gazed at the sword for a moment, raising it up to eye level as though he was trying to inspect every detail. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, and then his mouth suddenly opened wide. His canines lengthened and a growl left his lip. Clang. Click. Sich. He bit down hard, the blades suddenly shattering into countless pieces he swallowed with a single inhale. The gems that coated Miguel's body began to glow a healthy light, complex royal blue runes beginning to swirl about within them, making him look more like an otherworldly treasure than a human. Bang! Bang! Within Miguel's palms, two enormous great swords appeared. Each was over 2 meters long and 2 feet wide. Their weight falling to the ground alone left 2 enormous craters Miguel didn't seem to care he had begun to sink into. A fiendish, devilish grin spread across his lips, his body seeming to grow a size. I was already sick and tired of using that twig. Since you've woken me up, come and taste true strength. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. Miguel's foot rose into the air, the momentum of the world following his step. Chapter 1238. Miguel was so fast that Lionel could only react on instinct, quickly crossing his spear over his chest. It was like those enormous great swords were no heavier than a single feather, or so it seemed with the ease Miguel swung them. The spear across Lionel's chest immediately found itself bending in protest. Despite the fact Lionel had wanted to use it to protect himself, a strong, surging force bent it to the point it barreled into his sternum, causing his body to bow backward and fly out with a bang. A projectile of blood flew from Lionel's mouth, his entire rib cage threatening to shatter. If it wasn't for his bronze runes dispersing the force throughout his body, maybe his lungs and heart would have been riddled with bone shards by now. Lionel could tell that Miguel had instead lost his speed and, most importantly, his agility. However, when it came to a straight line bound and leap forward, strength alone could often overwhelm speed. And now that Miguel had taken the initiative, he proved this about as well as you possibly could. Miguel howled, his hair fluttering about wildly. He looked like a beast that had been released from its chains, his attack and pursuit relentless as though he couldn't feel fatigue. Every time he landed the ground would collapse, every time he shot forward an abyss would be left in his wake, every time he attacked the air split and sparking flames followed his swing as the atmosphere cried for mercy. Lionel found his body being beaten and bruised. He managed to find a way to block every time, but he could never escape the pain that came with it. His wrists threatened to shatter, his shoulders were continuously almost ripped from their sockets, and his legs and torso were beginning to show signs of deep internal bleeding, splotches of a grotesque blackish violet spreading beneath their skin. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. Blazing Dawn. Dauntless Day. The gold of Miguel's hair and eyes became like a blazing sun. Even his eyebrows followed suit, the endless flood of it making him look like a deity descended from the skies above. And yet, his coarse laughter and his fiendish grin warped that persona, giving him the image of endless bloodlust, the kind that could only be matched by a god of war. Howl. Miguel's howls caused the golden barriers that protected the audience to tremble and vibrate. The crowd could only imagine just how loud it was for Lionel, who was trapped in there. Whether by coincidence or design, everyone seemed to have landed on the same conclusion. This arena had become a cage and Lionel happened to be stuck in there with a beast. The Luxniks had quite frankly never seen this side of Miguel. Not only had he abandoned the light flexible sword that was the symbol of their family, but he didn't even seem to be using snow force any longer. They couldn't help but feel that the Miguel that they had all come to know was a facade from the very beginning, nothing more than an image he projected out to them. This was the true Miguel. An unrelenting, furious, battle maniac who wielded his swords like clubs and bellowed out war cries as though he wouldn't be satisfied until the whole of the dimensional verse heard his name. Bang! Visit. For a better user experience Lionel against the golden barrier, another cough of blood leaving his lips. By now, his clothes were in tatters. Where his skin was exposed no longer shone as resplendently as they had before, even his bronze runes seemed to have dimmed considerably. Miguel's relentless pursuit didn't pause for even a moment. Blazing like a golden meteor, he shot into the air, falling down toward Lionel with both his great swords raised high above his head. His hair and eyebrows gave of wisps of white gold fog. His eyes had begun to glow so bright that the whites had vanished, replaced by orbs of gold that pulsed with light. Lionel watched this scene, a light breath leaving his lips. Even that alone made him feel like his entire body was on fire. All right, if a brawl is what you want, come and have a brawl. Lionel's eyes closed for a moment, making it truly seem as though he had given in. But when they opened, his eyes, too, had become nothing more than orbs of light. However, his own blazed like shimmering sapphires, his aura imploding in the form of a pillar that seemed to want to pierce the skies. Star fusion. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. Wild plumes of sky blue smoke shot out from Lionel, his body suddenly vanishing from its position and appearing above Miguel. His white shirt was ripped from himself, revealing a torso no less ripped and defined than Miguel's own. His bronze runes were flooded with vital star force, causing them to pulse with the very same blue light as his halo hung above his head. Miguel continued to fall, unable to change his direction. But Lionel had already closed in, his feet slamming down on the top of the former's back and driving him into the ground. Bang! Miguel twisted in the air, blocking Lionel's foot with the flat of his blade and swinging forward with his other, his gaze lit with thoughts of splitting him in two. But what he found instead was Lionel's own blade. Spear and sword met in the skies, the reverberating impact sending Lionel spiraling so far into the air that he crashed into the barrier once again. At the same time, Miguel careened into the ground, falling into such a deep pit that it wasn't immediately obvious what happened to him. Unfortunately, though, this wasn't the kind of battle that had lulls and pauses. Two almost mindless roars shook the stadium. Visit. For a better user experience in the ground below, Miguel's aura alone shattered everything in its path, forcing the rocks to crumble and the surrounding walls to fall into the abyss. The elevation where the stages and platforms had been at fell by more than 50 meters, leaving a sinkhole that spread out for hundreds more. In the skies, Lionel's bellow shattered the ceiling of the golden dome, shards of white gold glass falling in all directions and precipitating in a beautiful rainfall. And then, a streak of blinding blue and another of blinding gold tore a path toward one another, meeting in the skies and causing a boom that deafened the ears of all those that heard it. Chapter 1239. Spear and great swords met in an endless torrent of attacks. Every collision caused shards of whistling wind to fly out in all directions. It was the kind of display of power that made one cringe and turn your head away, worried that their bodies wouldn't be able to handle what came next and find itself bent awkwardly and out of shape. However, the wild grins on both of their faces seemed to paint a different picture entirely. They were completely relentless, even when they were pushed to the ground, they sprung back up like springs, already prepared for the next 10 exchanges. Bang! The two were forcefully separated, finding themselves on opposite sides of the arena. Their breathing was even and deep, the thumping of their hearts and the rushing of their blood booming like drums and falling like waterfalls. Miguel exhaled a deep breath, a fog rising up from his swords as though they were being seared with heat. Dying embers of dusk. The 4 cycles came together. Without even stepping into the 6th dimension, Miguel had actually comprehended the entirety of the natural light realm. The glow in Lionel's gaze intensified. The strength of 1, 2, or 3 facets of a universal cycle was absolutely nothing compared to when they were deployed all at once. Only upon doing so would the true strength of universal force shine through. The only light of night. Blazing dawn. Dauntless day. Dying embers of dusk. The cycle of day, night, dawn, and dusk rotated about the skies, the center of the world being Miguel himself. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel exhaled his own breath. He hadn't even bothered to bring out his 4 seasons comprehension. Because it was true state, it could probably match 1 stage above, but 2 was too large of a gap to bridge. If he brought it out now, he would only end up countered and put himself on the back foot. But Lionel had more cards than he had shown. In the dimensional cleanse trial zone, Lionel had formed 3 forms of, not just 1. The issue was that the amount of vital star force he had was so small to begin with that executing just the first form only lasted a few minutes. Unfortunately, most of the accumulated vital star force Lionel had left the trial world with had been taken away by the segmented cube. Of course, it was vital to saving his life and making sure no lingering injuries crippled his hands, so it was a worthy exchange. Due to this, though, it took Lionel weeks to even months to accumulate enough vital force just for a few minutes of usage. At least, that was the case in a weak galaxy like the Milky Way. But Lionel wasn't there any longer, now was he? Lionel had already been on planet Luxnix for more than a month. Not only was it a pinnacle 6-dimensional world, it was perfectly chosen by the Luxnix for its high light and star elemental concentration. In that case, wasn't it perfect? The first stage of star fusion was. The second stage, though. Lionel's lips spread into a wild grin, the red in his eyes pulsing as the blue about him became a blazing curtain of crimson. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, a chorus of red raced across Lionel's body as he howled into the skies. His own cry sounded for more maddened than anything Miguel had been able to form. His body seemed to spring to life, a pair of wings that stretched outward for 10 meters each appearing to his back and his body being covered in delicate white gold scales, each etched with golden runes and shaped like small, miniature feathers. The billowing fog emitting from Lionel's head seemed to make his hair turn scarlet and lengthen, snaking out in all directions like wild hydras surging out from murky waters. With a single flap of Lionel's wings, the air around him shattered like glass, the ground splintering like an egg shell and the howling call of his roar being left behind by the sonic boom of his own speed. He appeared before Miguel in the blink of an eye, but the latter had already swung down one of his great swords, the power behind it carrying with it the strength of the natural light realm. Bang! The two erupted into a flurry of exchanges. Lionel's body seemed to be nearly invulnerable, even in the rare instances where he suffered an injury. It closed so fast that it felt as though it had never been there to begin with. Miguel's skin shimmered like crystals, his impenetrable gem force and relentless attacks backing his domineering nature. He fought nothing like a Luxnix. There wasn't the slightest bit about him that was elegant or refined, not the slightest hint of what it meant to embody purity was on his mind. All he cared about was being the best, his arrogance prepared to make even the darkness of night and the light of day revolve around him. The two clashed and separated, their collisions rebounding all across the arena in a way that was almost impossible to follow. The crowd found their heads swiveling from side to side almost uncontrollably just so that they could try their best to keep up. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel retracted his spear before releasing an endless torrent of pierces. His speed was so blinding that it felt as though dozens of spears had appeared in his hand. Miguel swiped one of his great swords to the side, brutishly slapping Lionel's spear to the side, and swinging down from above. Lionel took a fast and strong step forward, punching out toward Miguel's chest. The sound of metal and crystal meeting resounded through the arena, but Miguel flexed his back and widened his stance, absorbing the blow completely as he continued to swing down from above. Lionel's gaze flickered as he rotated to the side, barely stepping out of the downward swing and stamping down toward Miguel's wrist. However, as though he hadn't noticed, Miguel's forearms simply flexed, the blue runes swirling about his crystal skin jumping to life. In that moment, Lionel suddenly felt as though his foot had slammed into a steel wall. To make matters worse, Miguel suddenly released his grip on his sword, his palm snaking upward at an odd angle and catching Lionel's ankle. Lionel found himself being raised into the air, his gaze frighteningly cold. Bang! His body was pummeled into the ground, only to be raised again. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience force surged about Lionel's ankle, forcing Miguel to let go. Hooking the crook of his knee to Miguel's arm, he used the momentum to swing himself to the latter's back, choking around Miguel's neck with one arm and raising his spear to behead him with the other. Miguel roared, his neck bulging and his back erupting as a strong surge of force that sent Lionel flying backward. With another howl, Miguel beat his chest, sinking further and further into an undying madness. And then, his skin began to change once more. Slowly but surely, the crystal morphed into something more tangible and heavy, fusing with the new coming substance and making it far stronger than it had been just alone. Chapter 1240. The crystal that coated Miguel's skin seemed to rapidly shrink, concentrating the pulsing blue runes that had run within them toward his forehead. His muscles bulged a fold in size, suddenly gaining a rough texture to them and eventually losing all of its color. Before the eyes of everyone, it became a thick, leathery coat, one that bulged with both power and a pure, unblemished white that gave off its own light. At the same time, Miguel's hair and eyes lost their gold color as well, becoming bright shades of white. It almost became impossible to see his hair as anything other than strings of lights. It didn't even look real any longer, having completely lost its physical form. The illusory form of a majestic elephant appeared to his back, a surging tide of gem force flooding the surroundings. Miguel didn't even seem to try, but everything was suddenly coated in his aura. The ground and even the golden walls that surrounded them all began to grow crystal formations of their own, almost like rapidly spreading ice-forming crystalline constructs. With a snap, Miguel's great sword flew back into his hand. A single flex of his forearm caused the sturdy metal to whine, the imprint of his palm and fingers being etched onto its body. The level of strength it took to accomplish such a feat was simply beyond one's wildest imagination, and yet he had done so on nothing more than a whim. Miguel's head tilted to the skies, a roar escaping his lips. Explosive, concentric circles of collapsing and booming wind shot out along with his voice, shattering everything in its wake. In that moment, a surge of force began to violently shoot toward Miguel, his chest and stomach expanding by a size as the gem on his forehead only grew all the brighter. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience, Lionel flipped through the air, landing on his own 2 feet. His body was still covered by a blazing fog of red, a line of smoke rising from his body and becoming a thin line of energy in the air. From the moment Miguel ate his sword, Lionel had already understood what his ability was. Lionel had run into this ability before, but this was either a mutated form of it, or it was a unique ability that mimicked what the original ability could do. Of course. This ability was the Swallower Ability Index, the very same ability shared by Hephaestus of Valiant Heart Mountain. Hephaestus was able to gain the abilities of the beasts he ate, but this was a byproduct of the Steel Tier, or Tier 4, of the Swallower Ability Index. Of course, Hephaestus could only do this for low-level beasts, so there was a heavy cap on when his ability was Tier 4 and when it was not, but Miguel seemed to be very different. Lionel was absolutely certain that Hephaestus could not eat a sword. The unspoken limitation of the Swallower Ability Index was that whatever was eaten had to be organic. But, clearly, not only was Miguel not bound by this, but he even seemed to be capable of swallowing the force in the atmosphere, forcefully refueling himself and making it all his own. When faced with such a person, not only was their stamina practically endless, but their affinities suddenly became whatever they wanted it to be. If Hephaestus ate a low-level creature and it happened to have a sturdy bone structure, he would gain a portion of that. If it had a fire elemental affinity, he would also gain a portion of that. So on, and so forth. But, what about Miguel? If he swallowed force itself, what did that represent? What did it mean? What if he swallowed a force crystal? A pure force crystal? The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. With his ability, could he give himself whatever affinity he wanted so long as he ate enough? In fact, couldn't Miguel hunt and kill humans as well, swallowing their ethereal glabellas to take from them what he pleased? This level of innate talent was something even he had to respect. Lionel slowly walked toward Miguel. He could somewhat understand how the Starry Order elders felt. Miguel might, quite frankly, be one of the only people in existence capable of adapting to an innate node that wasn't his own. In fact, he was capable of adapting to almost anything, so long as he had time and the resources before him. Lionel's spear swept out to his side, the casual action causing many of Miguel's forming crystalline structures to shatter beneath the wind pressure alone. The sound of shattering glass and falling crystals resounded, the beauty of the resonance feeling nothing like the sight of the destruction. Miguel's inhale ended, the devilish grin on his face having grown only wider as his gaze landed on Lionel. He seemed to have grown an extra foot tall. His body up to his neck was covered by thick, leathery skin and his eyes were nothing but glowing orbs of white, following the tones set by his hair. The twinkling gem force around him only grew further in density, the small shards suddenly growing to the size of fists hailing down from the skies above. The rough beating of them and Miguel's heart seemingly fusing into one deathly rhythm. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, judgment. Miguel's voice seemed to have dropped by an entire octave. Even before the attack came, Lionel's pupils constricted, his body flipping backward and just barely dodging an enormous crystal pillar that had appeared from thin air. However, his feet had barely touched the ground again when his wings were forced to flap with all their strength, sending him beaming out of the way of another falling crystal pillar. Miguel's uproarious laughter resounded as these thick, destructive pillars continued to manifest from thin air. Judgment. 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 Bang. 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 A relentless barrage fell. The momentum was so great that the wind pressure alone made Lionel feel as though his skin was being torn in two. The golden barrier could finally no longer withstand the pressure. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. 3 crystal pillars fell all at once, cutting off Lionel's path of retreat from all sides. When they hit the ground in unison, everything shattered, shards of gold flying wildly throughout the arena. Chapter 1241. Lionel's expression flickered. Having these wings seemed cool, but it made the over-kilometer-long diameter of the arena seem far too small. To make matters worse, because Lionel had become used to them being nothing more than an illusion, having them become a sudden tangible part of him left him feeling awkward and uncoordinated. He realized then that he definitely should have spent the last few days going over the Luxnix family techniques that helped use these enormous pair of wings instead of getting lost in his game of chess with wise Star Order. But, as they say, hindsight was 20/20. The coldness in Lionel's gaze returned. He had lost himself in having fun in this battle and he hadn't been his usual self. The battles he had fought in the dimensional verse until now all felt like a struggle of life and death, so he never wasted time playing around. He would drown his opponent out in calculations and cut the simplest path to victory every time. Often, he didn't even have emotions or straying thoughts of his own, he was like an efficient machine, executing its orders. At this point, feeling that he was very quickly running out of power-ups to use, and simultaneously feeling that Miguel still had depths he had yet to expose, Lionel was tempted to revert to his usual battle style. It was quite ironic just how perfect a reflection of Lionel that Miguel was. Though the latter didn't have the former's calculative abilities, most of Miguel's battles usually ended just as easily. With what Miguel had comprehended from Lionel's innate node, he had even been able to one-shot the patriarch of the Viola family. Miguel hadn't used any of these comprehensions against Lionel, much like Lionel hadn't used his ability index much at all either. Of course, whether or not such comprehensions would be effective against Lionel was another matter entirely, but it was still the principle of the matter that truly counted. Miguel felt he didn't need to use Lionel's talent to defeat him. He could do it on his own. From the very beginning, he was better. The 3 pillars savagely fell, Lionel's head tilting up and a smile spreading across his face. It wasn't laced with madness nor was there a fiendish aura to it. All it carried was a childish excitement. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel remembered well the first time he had experienced such a feeling. He was within Camelot's zone facing an army of demons. For the first time, the weight of killing others wasn't at the forefront of his mind. After all, what he faced weren't humans, they were cold-hearted monsters ready and willing to tear him limb from limb. That was the moment that apprehension, anxiety, and guilt gave way, becoming the emotions that he had always felt, that he had always wanted to feel. A giddy excitement. It was clear that he had already made his decision. I'm not just a knight. I can be considered a mage too. It seems I won't be able to find out the limits of combustion today. Bang! 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 Everything collapsed. The arena began to sink, the golden barriers shattered to pieces. Harsh screams and cries of terror called out as many feared for their lives, feeling as though in the next moment, they would no longer be among the living. Eleanor reacted just as quickly. She had originally used the same defensive mechanism Orinik had because she didn't think that things would need to go so far. But, it seems she had underestimated these two boys a bit. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, it wasn't that their raw strength was so great, but their will seemed to take tangible form, strengthening their attacks. They had already gained characteristics of the sixth-dimensional god path before even stepping foot into it. Lionel with his king's might. And Miguel with the odd power behind his words. Eleanor lightly tapped her foot, an enormous barrier forming. However, while her son's was a delicate violet color, her own was a vibrant green. In a moment, everything settled just for an instant, that is. Bang! The three crystal pillars shattered to ash. Just as the gem shards shot out in all directions, an enormous pillar of violet force shot into the skies, outlining Lionel's figure as several force arts began to be quickly drawn in the air. The pupils of those who understood constricted. Most force arts were completely invisible to the naked eye as they were drawn by the ever-so-elusive soul force. For Lionel's own to take form and for them to even witness their drawing like this. SHU. 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 Arrows of earth, fire and light fell from the skies. But just as quickly as they formed, they evolved into spears and javelins, falling from the skies like a torrential rainfall. Visit. For a better user experience, Miguel's crystal constructs responded in kind, the skies becoming like the clash of fireworks, explosions of force, rock and stone erupting and fluttering motes of light falling from their collisions. On the ground, the two tore a path toward one another, one bathed in white and the other in violet. Boom! Lionel seemed completely invisible when strengthened by his king's might, and yet Miguel seemed just as much so. Every time Lionel dug deeper, he seemed to find a new ceiling, his strength climbing and growing. It was as though even when he said Lionel had awakened him, he was still in a deep sleep, slowly opening his eyes wider and wider with every collision. Miguel opened his mouth wide, biting at Lionel's spear, only to receive a swing of its butt to the side of the face. His head spun to the side, but he easily used that momentum to his advantage, allowing his torso and feet to spin into two great slashes with his great swords. Lionel also followed the momentum of his spear's blunt attack, carrying it over to place it in position to block both swings. His feet sunk down into the ground, his body quaking beneath the impact, only for him to realize too late that Miguel had sent 3 attacks, not just 2. A kick formed the third prong of the attack, colliding with Lionel's lower torso. Visit. For a better user experience, Miguel's wild, almost bestial offensive style forced Lionel to eat a loss soon after he had. Chapter 1242. Lionel skidded backward against the force of the kick, but the blow was forcefully dispersed to the ground beneath him. His control over the earth element had skyrocketed to an even higher level after entering. It felt as though the entire planet itself was backing his fight. His spear snaked forward, aiming for Miguel's head, throat and heart in quick succession. Every time he pierced, it was as though a raging flood dragon followed his movements, his spearmanship becoming so pure and unabashed that it breathed like it had life of its own. Miguel's swordsmanship was several times more wild and lacked structure or foundation. Compared to the technique-driven style he had had while using his thin sword, and his ability to shift through one technique after another, always countering Lionel perfectly, he might as well have been a caveman now. But there was a special sort of air that was carried along by those simple strikes. They cut off all paths of retreat and thwarted deadly strikes with the greatest of ease, the explosive power that backed them feeling like they carried the weight of an entire world. Before anyone could realize just what had happened, over a day had already passed, each still being just as relentless as the other and it feeling as though they had an endless amount of trump cards and rebuttals to thrust at their opponent. However, it was slowly becoming clear that one had more to give than the other did. Lionel could apply this self-created knight technique he had formulated to amplify his mage arts. In addition, the drain on the vital star force supply he had was much lesser as well as half the burden was taken on by his mind. Unfortunately, having great stamina versus having the ability to endlessly replenish your own were two different matters. Lionel, of course, had the gold-scaled koi fish, but he hadn't used its ability even once. Though he could probably say that it was his beast companion and get away with it, he didn't even think of doing so. He wanted to see to the depths of Miguel's limits, to force him to give everything he had and still realize that there was a taller mountain beyond. But it was becoming increasingly difficult to do so. The gap was large. Some would even say too large. Lionel had more than held his own, especially considering he was still holding back even at this moment. But Tier 4 was Tier 4 while Miguel was a half step to the 6th dimension. Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel's smile didn't fade, he found himself to be amusing. He didn't just want to win, he wanted to win his way. Lionel's spear blade swept along the ground, a massive wave of molten earth following it to attack Miguel. A crystal whale construct formulated into the skies. It was over 50 meters long, carrying with it a weight that couldn't even be fathomed. Boom! It dropped like an anchor before Lionel's attack, causing an explosion that took both at once. If it wasn't for the barrier formed by Alienor, there was no doubt that the destruction would have only been all the more violent. Lionel let out a heavy breath, sparks of fire leaving his lips. Deep breaths expanded and contracted his chest, a few fractures that could be found littered throughout his body healing far more slowly than they had at the beginning of his battle despite the fact the second awakening of his healing branch was very much active. In his moment of reprieve, Miguel had already closed the distance. Damn! Lionel's mind reacted quicker than his body, an enormous shield of earth blocking the swing of Miguel's blades. The twin great swords burst through, finding Lionel's spear laying in wait. But his defenses seemed weaker than usual. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, Lionel found himself flying through the air, shaking his head inwardly. He seemed to have been in a battle of equals with Miguel. But, whenever each brought out a new trump card, wasn't it always him who was sent flying? This was exactly why he was so hesitant about bringing out all he had. If things were like this at this stage, shouldn't he find an opportunity to win before Miguel went all out? Lionel laughed at himself. What a silly thought. He hadn't been using his mind much during this battle and he had actually let such a ridiculous conclusion to fester and grow to this point. Why was it that he had allowed Candle and Vice to roam free? Wasn't that because he would have to defeat all the savants of the dimensional verse one way or another? Why was it that he had kept his mind in reserve during this battle? Wasn't it so that he could bask in the feeling of an enjoyable battle? So why was he suddenly doing something so contradictory to both? A subtle feeling just within Lionel's grasp lingered before him. Sparks went off in his dreamscape, a network he had begun to build to rectify instinctual battling and logical battling feeling just a step away. It was like having a word ready at the tip of your tongue, but easy 10 times more infuriating. This feeling, Lionel closed his eyes, his breathing becoming steadier and steadier. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. Wasn't he the one who had said it didn't matter? If he wanted to claim that position at the top of the mountain for himself, why should he be constantly worried about the progress and strength of others? As long as he, himself, was strong enough. What did the rest of it matter for? What did the rest of it count for? Nothing. Nothing at all. The halo above Lionel's head began to glow a devastating brightness in that moment. As he flew through the air, it expanded to almost a meter in diameter, shooting down to Lionel's feet before slowly moving upward. Bang! Lionel landed and a cloud of dust shot in all directions. But in the next moment, a sight that none who had come this day would ever forget appeared. Lionel's figure vanished from sight beneath the commotion, but space itself seemed to freeze over. Everything was suddenly encased in a cube of ice, space itself solidifying into a tangible plane. And then... crack! Everything splintered. As though space had become a sheet of glass, it shattered, and yet it all seemed to be held together by an invisible force. The plumes of dust slowly began to clear, revealing a tall silhouette. The temperature plummeted by several degrees, a cold shiver creeping up the spines of many. Visit for a better user experience. Chapter 1243. A harsh cold spread out in all directions, the air cracking at its seams as though dome of glass had just been shattered and was now barely holding itself together. Bright blues, deep purples and swirling blacks surged out in all directions, suddenly dispersing to reveal an armor the likes of which those here had simply never before laid their eyes upon. The divine armor was fitted with many plates, forming a complex and interlocking array of metals that made movement as smooth as fabric. It exuded a frosty aura, appearing as though a layer of beautiful blue, silver and black or was coated with a thin and reflective layer of ice. It spread out upon Lionel's wings without missing a single beat, flaps of metal sheets opening and closing as though it was breathing, releasing frosty steam that froze over space all the more. The helmet that covered Lionel's head completely hid his gaze, but the shimmering golden spear upon his forehead and the bronze halo above his head told a story of their own. Oranic's gaze narrowed. The divine armor technique was most definitely among the strongest of the Morales. But, not everyone could forge their own, let alone to do so at this level. In fact, of all his abilities, Lionel's crafting was maybe the most untouchable. Miguel found himself stuck within frozen space. As fragile and on the verge of collapse as the world around them now seemed, it was anything but. Just the tiniest movement made him feel as though all his strength was being snapped out, and the slower he moved, the more icicles formed along his skin, only slowing him even further. Lionel's dark ice divine armor had stacked with the characteristics of his warping domain divine armor. The latter was a fourth-dimensional divine armor evolved to match a fifth-dimensional one, while the former was the same for the fifth and sixth dimensions. The result was a devastating ability even those well into the sixth dimension could not ignore. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Lionel's palm flipped over, his kinetic spear vanishing to reveal his water domain spear. It looked almost like a trident, its body covered in blue, sapphire-like scales, and its head having one very prominent spear blade and two much smaller ones jetting off to the side at an angle. Miguel roared even as Lionel shot into motion once again. The skies cracked, motes of sparkling space falling in all directions. While Lionel himself shot through these falling shards of space as though they were nothing, Miguel was forced to dodge them as they came. Those that managed to touch upon even his force froze it in time, space, and functionality, rendering it completely useless. In the moment, it was like only half of Miguel's strength could be deployed, the rest of it being swallowed up by Lionel's dark ice domain. Strength. Miguel swung down, meeting Lionel's spear. But, behind it, he found a relentless, overflowing pressure. It was as though he was facing an ocean's tide. One wave came forth, only to recede and for a second to replace it, and then a third, then a fourth. By the sixth, Miguel's own strength had been completely eroded away, his arm turning numb as he was forced to take a step back. Lionel's spear spun in the palms, a barrage of pierces, sweeps and slices. He chained them all into a combination of lethal strikes. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience he could truly feel the essence of the water domain spear. Something within him had clicked. All this time, he took up a spear, was flashed with the images of its previous owner, and forcefully grasped its domain. But he had missed something very important. The peak spears that stood at the height of its grade never flashed him with any images of its previous owner. Only the sub-spears that littered the base of its hill did so. Then there was the domain. Was it really something he had comprehended? Not really. Didn't his divine armors come with domains themselves? He didn't have to comprehend his divine armors, the ability just manifested due to its nature. That was when it all snapped into place. The spear domain would exist with or without him. Whoever picked up this spear would be able to use this domain. There was nothing special about him in the slightest. All this time, he had thought that he was ignoring instinct for the sake of gaining a deeper, personal understanding of his spear. He wanted to grasp it on his own, to not have his mind clouded by the comprehensions of others. But, in doing so, he had been diverted down the wrong path. When Lionel first claimed his duality spear, it fought against him. Anyone would logically conclude that this was because the spear had a soul, but Lionel had conveniently ignored this. It wasn't because he couldn't accept that there were certain things he simply didn't understand yet, but it was rather because he didn't want to lose himself down the rabbit hole such an acceptance would lead him down. While all of Lionel's stubbornness was in one part due to his endless pursuit of logic and understanding, another large part was just his ego. It wasn't just about pursuing logic, but it was also the satisfaction he felt knowing that he had ripped something apart to its bare bones and that it laid out before him, unable to hide any of its secrets from his eyes. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. Lionel felt his heart pump, his spear technique becoming faster and more subtle. He had never considered himself to be skilled in the spear. He forcefully integrated comprehensions he gained and sometimes relied on his spear domain lineage factor, but he had always been lacking in something fundamental. Even back when he fought the branch members of the Luxnix family, he still admitted that their raw skill with their weapons was still beyond him despite the fact he defeated them with ease. What was he missing? Why wasn't he a true spear master? Why did wielding his bow and his spear feel so different? Why did one come so naturally while the other moved along so slowly and so awkwardly? It was style. Lionel had never breathed his own life in his spear. Wise Star Order had said it quite clearly. Only someone who had their heads flooded with water would think that weapons could have souls. Wasn't it obvious why the domain spears didn't have the memories of previous owners attached to them? It was because Lionel was meant to be the owner. His soul was meant to be their soul. Bang! Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, a blinding golden light shot up into the skies. Chapter 1244. The golden spear hovering before Lionel's forehead suddenly grew a size. A ring of light formed on either side of it, wrapping around Lionel's helmet and forming a crown with a blinding golden spear as its centerpiece. It and Lionel's bronze halo seemed to resonate, the two vibrating like twin pieces of precious metal. In that moment, Lionel felt as though his eyes had suddenly opened wide. His level 2 spear force trembled. From a neutral white color, it blossomed forth, suddenly becoming sprinkled with flecks soft gold. Lionel's gaze became hazy and unfocused, and yet his assault only grew more powerful. If before it had felt like Lionel's spear was a raging flood dragon, at this moment, it truly became one. Water force bent to Lionel's will without the slightest inclination of resistance. With every pierce, it would fuse with Lionel's king's might and his level 2 spear force, forming a roaring eastern dragon that made Miguel feel as though he was being pummeled by a mountain. Miguel sliced down with both his great swords, trying to behead the dragon roaring toward him. But he suddenly found both his blades being rebounded away as though he had just collided with a blade and not two beast constructs. Shirring. Lionel suddenly found that he could only use twice, but he didn't even blink a single eye. His movements flowed seamlessly from one motion to the next. Whereas his spearmanship in the past had felt like a disjointed union of powerful individual moves, his calculative mind and skill seemed to have finally fused into one. Visit. For a better user experience, each attack became like a sacrificed chess piece that set up the next. Each significant strike was like a fork of pieces on the board, one of which Miguel would have no choice but to sacrifice to move forward. Each combination led to another, then another, an endless chain and torrent of barrages that had no sight and end. The beauty of roaring water dragons beneath shattered ice particles of space was too much to describe. It felt as though all those spectating had been transported to another world, only to experience the battle of a deity of ice and water versus a deity of light and darkness. Miguel recovered from Lionel's sudden and enormous leap in strength as only a genius could. His fiendish grin only grew livelier. "Come on." Lionel's spear howled, the ring on his finger flickering with an imperceptible glow. Every time it collided with Miguel, a shockwave would travel through the latter's body, jetting out from his back in powerful concentric circles. At the same time, Miguel found his own strikes being severely weakened and sometimes entirely frozen by Lionel's domain, only leaving him susceptible to stronger attacks. Had it not been for his tough elephant skin and its superiority in dimension, he would have long since been littered with holes. And yet, his laughter only became more resounding, his force building up momentum as though it was endless. Bang! 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 Lionel's spear spun, wheels of water following its trajectory. Every time it did, he landed another strike, 3 falling in quick succession. Visit. For a better user experience, Miguel's inner organs finally couldn't seem to take it anymore, his mouth overflowing with a combination of trickling and jetting blood. 3 large dents appeared in his tough skin exterior, Lionel's third blow nearly piercing all the way through and reaching bone. Beneath his mask, Lionel's breath heaved, his face drenched in sweat. He was already nearing his limits before he put on his divine armor, but now he was only approaching them all the more. Even the ice-cool nature of it couldn't seem to stop his body from overheating. As for his innate node, he never thought of using it even once. The Luxnick seemed to believe that it would be in better hands if it was with Miguel. Lionel had no need to prove himself to them as he had the backing of both his mother and wise Star Order. However, with this pride etched deep within his heart, that wasn't nearly enough. That innate node was his own. Whether he cared to use it or not was none of the business of the Luxnicks. But, right here and now, he would show them just how wrong they were. Lionel pulled back his spear once more, his force surging throughout his body. He squeezed out the last bit of vital star force he had, his gaze lighting up and blooding with such a fierce light that they almost shone through his visor. Lionel poured the last of his strength into his dark ice domain, increasing its strength to the point Miguel was truly frozen in place, shards of what looked like broken glass surrounding his body and his swords to the point he was completely unable to move. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. The miniature humanoid fog of violet rose from Lionel's head, sitting above his spear crown with a lofty air and presence. He wouldn't allow anything in this world to block his path. Even if it was himself. The bellow that left Lionel's lips must have been heard all across planet Montex. The will blanketed everything it reached, suffocating the spectators until they seemed to have lost the ability to think any thoughts. Their gazes were all focused on the very same young man. That was. Until he seemed to vanish. The separation of Lionel and his spear seemed to have gone up in smoke. Though logically they all felt that there must have been a human behind the supreme strike they were witnessing, their senses told them instead that there was nothing there at all. All that remained was the strike in all its gorgeous beauty. A flood dragon of water, transparent and clear to the point the spear within could be seen. Its scales were outlined by a sharp spear force as the sound of a blade gliding along a whetstone resonated throughout the surroundings. And then, it collided with Miguel's torso, landing right upon the very same shallow wound Lionel had caused previously. But at this moment, everything seemed to pause for just a second. Silence fell, space froze, and a hollow, soft wind glided by at a gentle pace. And then, Miguel's touch outer skin was torn to shreds, the spear exiting through a bloodied hole much too large for its slim body. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience. Chapter 1245. Lionel's breath came out in heaving swallows. His arm hung out, parallel with his piercing spear, his body not even having the strength to hold his other arm up. Miguel should have been blown backward, but the dark ice domain had forcefully kept him in place, forcing his body to take on the full brunt of the strike and tearing a hole the size of 2 fists all the way through his chest. A wheezing cough left Miguel's lips, his body still being held up by shards of frozen space. Half of Lionel's spear had gone through his body, coating its sapphire scales within a dense mass of thick, flowing blood. Miguel's fiendish grin slowly faded, his gaze meeting Lionel's own. "Maybe one day we'll have a real fight," Lionel said through his heavy breath. Miguel didn't say anything in response, his eyes having lost their previous glow and expression going back to how it had always been. It seemed baffling that he had ever been that howling young man from before. But, even without more words than that, the two had come to quite a deep understanding of one another. Lionel very much meant the words he had spoken. This Miguel he had defeated was maybe, at best, 20% of what his true strength was. In fact, according to Lionel's estimation, that was an overly positive view. This was probably closer to 10% of Miguel's true strength, most likely less. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience on the surface, this seemed ridiculous. But, looking at things from Miguel's perspective, they likely began to make sense. Miguel was an extraordinary talent, this was something that no one could deny. He was born only a few months ahead of Lionel, so their ages were quite negligible, and in another life, they would probably have grown up to be as close as Lionel and James had once been. With the talent he was granted, Miguel had made it to the quasi-6th dimension years ago. However, he didn't have the background to allow him to enter the Void Palace outside of their selections like those from more prominent families could have, so he could only stall in his own progress. That said, this didn't mean that Miguel didn't improve at all. In fact, he had improved almost daily, leaping forward by unfathomable lengths. It was just that it was all reliant on Lionel's innate node. Miguel could gain affinity with practically anything just by eating enough of it, but why would he divert his attention when such a powerful force was within his body? There was no doubt in Lionel's mind that Miguel's comprehension of Scarlet Star Force was several folds beyond him, they couldn't even be compared. When things are looked at from this perspective, you could begin to understand the problem. Miguel's entire battle style and form was predicated on Scarlet Star Force. Even without using the force itself, just the comprehensions of destruction he had gained and the numerous techniques he had formulated around it would speak for themselves. Much like how Lionel had recently decided to build the foundation of his strength with his Scarlet Star innate node as the foundation, so too had Miguel reached the same conclusion. Except, unlike Lionel, he had the constant guidance of experts, so he had made this logical conclusion much earlier on and had stuck with it. Visit. For a better user experience, the best analogy was that Lionel was battling a fish, and he had suddenly made that fish battle on land instead. The fact Miguel had pushed him to this extent while handicapped in this fashion spoke volumes not only about his talent, but also his deep-seated pride. Lionel doubted that Miguel had even known the innate node within him wasn't his own until recently. Why would the Star Order elders ever tell him such a thing? Even if they ultimately agreed with such a decision, there was no need to run their own names through the mud in the process. Of course, there were probably benefits Miguel had gotten from the Scarlet Star innate node that couldn't be completely divorced from his current battle prowess. For example, he had likely only graduated from the Snowy Star Owl lineage factor so quickly because he could gain the affinity boost from Lionel's innate node. However, Lionel had a feeling that this wouldn't matter much. If he hadn't had the innate node, with the backing of the Luxnix, he could have just been force-fed all sorts of high-level light elemental crystals and pure crystals. By then, the result wouldn't have been as exaggerated, but it would still be comparable. The largest difference would only become more obvious as he left the white stone elephant behind, continued onward. Lionel was even more certain that without his innate node, Miguel would have been able to build his combat prowess with a different foundation, and though he would also be weaker than if he used Scarlet Force, he would still be able to beat the current Lionel. It was almost too obvious. The reason why Miguel's sword swings had all been so simple and wild was purely because all the techniques he had were purposely not used by him. To put things in the most blunt way possible, even now, Lionel could not defeat a full-powered Viola family patriarch. But Miguel had done so in a single strike. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, all of this said, this battle was designed to be unfair from the very beginning. Had Miguel hoped to rely on his destructive capabilities, he might have lost even sooner. Lionel's current innate node only hurt him because it had grown too far out of his control. However, the innate node Miguel currently had was at a level where Lionel could not only easily bear it, but he was basically immune to it. Still, Miguel had no idea that Lionel had regrown his innate node already, and he was very much unaware of how Lionel would have countered him easily. No matter how you looked at it, Miguel was an unfortunate loser in this situation. Lionel took a deep breath and began to move, but Miguel had already done so. In a move that stunned those watching, he pierced a hand into his own right hip, ripping out something that shimmered with a blinding red-gold light. Then he tossed it toward Lionel before the last of his strength wavered and he collapsed. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience. Chapter 1246. Lionel caught the innate node in a hand. Seeing how small it was, he couldn't help but sigh. All of this was caused by a small thing barely the size of a thumbnail. That was right, the innate node within Miguel looked like a piece of a gem one might not even notice by a roadside if it wasn't for the blinding light it was giving off. It was completely unlike Lionel's own, which was so large it had taken over his entire kidney. At a glance, Lionel could tell that while Miguel had been able to adapt, he hadn't been able to do so perfectly. For one, the innate node hadn't grown along with him. Though Lionel wasn't certain if it was meant to grow to the exaggerated size of his own, he was pretty sure that this was far too small. Secondly, the aura that this innate node was giving off was only at the 4th dimension. Miguel was already a step away from the 6th, and yet the innate node he had taken from Lionel had only crossed a single-dimensional barrier in all these years. It was clear and obvious that the transplant wasn't perfect, and if it wasn't for Miguel's ability, it likely wouldn't have shown any progress at all. What was even more obvious was that the help Miguel had gained from this innate node to progress his lineage factor was far less than Lionel had originally assumed. Realizing these things, how could Lionel not feel that things were practically comical at this point? All this commotion for this. At the same time though, Lionel felt an apprehension creep up within his heart. His innate node was actually so powerful that proper comprehension of it had given Miguel so much strength. Lionel suddenly coughed, his divine armor faded away as he fell backward. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience. I'm tired as hell. Lionel was asleep before he even hit the ground. He didn't even register that having lost the support of his spear, Miguel had fallen at the same time. Lionel's eyes opened slowly, finding himself staring at a familiar ceiling. He had been stripped down to his boxers again, though, causing his lip to twitch. I really need to talk to Mom about this. Lionel was in the process of shaking his head when he smelt a familiar scent lingering in the air. That fragrance of apple was undeniable, and it definitely wasn't coming from him. At the same time, he was definitely alone in this room right now, so that could only mean. Damn it. This time, nothing stopped Lionel from shaking his head. Lionel looked toward his hand to find that his innate node was actually still in his palm. Then again, there were probably very few people who could hold a Scarlet Star Force innate node and not be affected by it. Whoever took it out of him the first time definitely suffered greatly. It was a miracle that Miguel even survived. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, Lionel raised his hand up above his head, taking a good look at the innate node. What did you just say? Chapter 1247. Lionel raised an eyebrow. This was the first time he had ever heard shock in Wise Star Order's voice. Even when he had been taken off guard by the fact Lionel's innate node had regrown itself, it had been marred by so much pain that it didn't shine through the way that it should have. And, quite frankly, if Wise Star Order had to decide what he was more shocked by, it was definitely this realization. What's wrong with you? WH. What's wrong with me? Wise Star Order didn't even have a witty comeback ready this time. He was caught between wanting to strangle Lionel to death, bashing his head against a wall, and praying to a non-existent god to explain to him if he had already died and entered the gates of hell. Wise Star Order took deep breaths. His murderous thoughts would only end up harming himself. He had become used to controlling his impulses enough that he calmed eventually, shaking his head furiously. Say what you said one more time. I'm hungry. Lionel murmured. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience, he sat up, ready to ignore Wise Star Order to go and deal with that. But, he suddenly found a familiar table once again spread with food. However, this time, he hadn't been able to smell anything because it was all so perfectly packaged and ready. Lionel blinked and walked over, opening the first container. When the aroma hit him, he felt his legs go weak. This food, it was heaven sent. He had never felt such a strong need to stuff his face until his body imploded. This time, he didn't control his impulses, immediately diving in. Just the first bite made his blood lap around his body, surging around at ungodly speeds and making his heart sing. This is so good. You little bastard. Answer my question. You didn't ask a question. Lionel spoke between muffled bites. You stupidly asked me to repeat something you already heard the first time more than clearly enough. What's wrong with you, old man? Have you gone senile already? Wise Star Order's deep breaths got louder. Lionel thought about making a lewd joke, but he eventually refrained. This old man really seemed like he might explode any time now. Visit. For a better user experience, alright. Fine. Where are these supposed 10 nodes of yours? The first is in my brainstem, 2 down my spine, 1 for each of my lungs, 1 in my stomach, 1 for the outflow of blood through my heart and 1 for the inflow. Finally, there's 1 in my left kidney, and my Scarlet Star Force innate node is in my right kidney. Wise Star Order fell into silence for a very long time, almost as though he had to go and confirm this for himself. Unfortunately, his perception was limited while stuck within the necklace, so he could only vaguely make out that Lionel was, indeed, telling the truth. But, that only floored him all the more. Wise Star Order was a savant, so he had never had to form nodes of his own. Or, more accurately, he couldn't. This was the trade-off that came with being granted among the most powerful talent potentials in all of the universe. But, that didn't mean he didn't have a strong fundamental understanding. Unlike other savants, Wise Star Order could take over bodies. As such, he had certain methods to circumvent his limitations as a savant. No body he had ever taken over had been in the 3rd dimension, so he had never experienced it personally, but he knew exactly how important the foundation of nodes in the 3rd dimension could become in the future. Why? Don't you think that's the perfect setup for nodes? Basically, my entire respiratory system is boosted by force. Unfortunately, after my innate node regrew, I abandoned much of my initial goals for my nodes. Most of my strength comes from either my raw body strength or external force now. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience, what? Yeah. Lionel said absent-mindedly, still devouring container after container of food. Because all of my nodes are connected and work in a feedback loop of sorts, I have to be careful because of my Scarlet Star Force innate node. For example, when I take a breath, oxygen floods my lungs. That process is immediately amplified by my nodes, and it facilitated the diffusion of oxygen into my bloodstream. That blood will make it to my heart and be rushed out by yet another node. Then there's the matter of my kidneys and stomach. My blood is constantly being passively purified, but not as much as it technically could. Together, the system is efficient. But, because of the bottleneck of the weakness of my body, I can't make full use of it. If I let it all go and work like it was meant to, I feel like I would burn up from the inside out. If I wasn't limited like this, I would have probably reached the peak of the snowy star owl lineage factor a long time ago. Wise Star Order found himself taking long breaths again. If he still had a heart and lungs, it would probably be leaping out of his throat right this moment. He really couldn't control himself any longer. If he heard one more nonsensical thing, he might completely explode. Let me get this straight. You formed 10 nodes capable of perfectly supplementing your Buddha's strength in every way. But, because you were afraid of a node you were born with as a baby, you put it under lock and key and continued like nothing was wrong? Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience. Lionel blinked, pondering for a moment as he swallowed a mouthful of rich soup. He wanted to describe it as liquid gold, but he was certain that gold wasn't anywhere near as appetizing. For a moment, he almost forgot to answer the question. Well, it's not exactly like that. It wasn't the innate node I was born with as a baby. It's like 100 times bigger than it was then, and I hadn't had it all my life. That thing's dangerous. I'm gonna kill him. I'm really gonna kill him. Chapter 1248. It took a long time for Wise Star Order to calm down. Or, more accurately, for him to stop writhing under the torture the necklace put him through to force him to calm down. Even after he was heaving for breath for a reason beyond his anger, it still didn't seem to have faded. For as long as he could remember, Wise Star Order had always hated stupid people. This was why his last life was among the hardest to pull off, because he actually had to be nice to idiots. It was a torturous hell all to its own. After his centuries of sacrifice didn't pan out like he wanted, he had reverted to his old self. No, he was even worse. If he hadn't been restrained, he might have really killed Lionel, even if it meant never getting the answers he wanted. Do you have any idea how important your nodes are to the foundation of your strength? How is it that you've even survived this long? Well, I have a pretty special magic system backing me. Thanks to my mage core, using atmospheric force is pretty easy. So, ignoring my nodes has always been pretty easy. Lionel's mage core had blossomed into an enormous tree by this point in his ethereal glabella. It was covered in the same 5 colored leaves that had made up the original, but now there was a 6th slowly germinating and rooting itself. It had a radiant blue color and was sometimes misty, sometimes icy, and other times as free-flowing as water. From the very beginning, the mage core represented the true state of Camelot's magic. With it, Lionel didn't need a spiritual medium like a wand or a staff to use magic. As such, ignoring his own nodes had been exceptionally easy. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience. Wise Star Order paused. He had been in Lionel's ethereal glabella before. Of course, he had been distracted by the 7 stars, but there was no way he'd missed the mage core, especially after he had hidden the second half of his soul away. Lionel's mother had a lot of new things he could learn about the mage core and the techniques she had left behind for him. But, he had yet to get to them just yet. Do you have any idea what you've been doing to yourself? Lionel laughed. Why don't you just explain instead of tiptoeing around everything so you can have more chances to call me an idiot? Ignoring your own nodes is like trying to breathe with your lungs clipped. It's like trying to speak without a tongue. It's like trying to eat without your fucking stomach. How could you be so stupid? Lionel shook his head. You think I don't realize this is a problem? But what do you want me to do about it? The innate node Miguel took out of him was the size of a thumbnail. Mine is the size of a fist. Do you not understand my dilemma here? Wise Star Order was taken aback again. What? It's the size of a fist. It's taken over my whole right kidney. If I don't restrict my nodes, all of my blood would flow through it. If that happens, it'll literally burn from the inside out. You wouldn't even have a chance at taking over my body anymore at that point. Visit. For a better user experience. Wise Star Order was, once again, left entirely speechless. An innate node the size of a fist? That was completely unheard of. To put this matter into perspective, the fact Lionel had formed his regular nodes out of 100 cells already placed him at the pinnacle of geniuses. What made innate nodes so special aside from the power of force they held was the fact they were so large to begin with. A fingernail compared to the size of a 100-cell node was astronomical. If you also consider the fact that a 10-cell node was already considered to be quite large, then the fact that most could only form 1-cell nodes, and you'd understand just how exaggerated this matter was. Y's star order couldn't even begin to wrap his head around what the hell a node the size of a fist represented. In fact, his head felt light and he didn't even want to argue anymore. Explain how you formed your 10 nodes to me. Lionel just gave Y's star order a casual explanation. He had felt like the only way to reach 100% compatibility with his nodes was to form 10. It was the only way to ensure that he got both his kidneys as that everything would be balanced. After listening, Y's star order fell into deep silence. Lionel could feel him calculating something, though he felt that his tools were more lacking than his were to do so. Was this how normal people thought? It seemed slow and inefficient. Visit. For a better user experience though, that conclusion was only considering Y's star order's raw soul strength. He still computed things faster than Lionel overall, he was just wasting his max potential. But that could only be expected considering he didn't have Lionel's ability nor the higher level dream force. I see. By the time Y's star order had spoke, Lionel was already on his last container of food, the satisfaction he felt not wavering in the slightest. It should be a series of compounding factors. Trying to form both nodes at the same time. Your father's concoctions. The fact that the locations you chose happened to mirror each other perfectly. The fact that one of those locations happened to be the exact location our node had been birthed into in the first place. The fact you were actually stupid enough to try, you really are a lucky bastard to be alive right now. Lionel raised an eyebrow. There's something you're still not telling me. It's not that I'm not telling you, it's that it's far above your pay grade. Why do you think there's a hard cap at 9 nodes? What's regulating the limits? What's stopping people from forming 10, 11, 12, 50, even? You basically stole energy from the regulator of the dimensional verse and used it to do something that should have been impossible. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Chapter 1249. Lionel placed down his final plate, his brows furrowing. Regulator? You're not a complete fool when you decide so. Think about it with that head of yours. When a weapon reaches the life grade, it becomes a holistic whole, fusing to become something of complete oneness and becoming a unique existence. Across cultures, there are countless philosophies that follow that sort of mantra. Lionel nodded. He could already think of one, and that was just Earth. The concept of 1 giving birth to 2, and 2 to 3, and 3 to 1. A cyclical beauty. It seemed that the life grade was very much like this philosophy. Since you know, then the answer is both simple and complex. What is the bigger example of oneness than the entire dimensional verse itself? Lionel froze. He didn't know if he was imagining it, but he felt as though a strong breeze had brushed against the back of his neck, sending a tingling sensation down his back. Y's star order frowned. He understood. The Luxnix ancestor hadn't expected this. Understanding this was both a blessing and a curse, and it was also the key to grasping the God path far beyond the first step at the 6th dimension. But the curse portion of this all weighed exceptionally heavy. It was all speculation and even Y's star order had only heard tidbits and rumors about it. For once, he had harmed Lionel without even trying to do so. He had genuinely not expected Lionel to grasp anything from the words he had just spoken. Visit. For a better user experience, the difference between understanding and truly understanding were two different concepts. It was like the difference between knowing that a car ran on gas and understanding how combustion engines worked. They couldn't be compared. The fact that Lionel understood what he meant with just a single sentence spoke volumes about the kind of level his mind worked at. Seems you screwed me this time, old bastard. You win another round. Y's star order's lip twitched. He understood to that depth as well. I really didn't even do it on purpose this time. How could I think a fool like you could have a little bit of intelligence? What Lionel had understood was complex and multi-layered, but he was fairly certain that his conclusion was correct. Everything is a matter of perspective. He thought to himself. A weapon is considered to be an object, but how many metals is it forged of? And could it even be considered independent of its creators? And even if it entered the life grade, would it really, truly, be one existence? What about its atoms? What about the parts of its atoms? The parts of those parts? Everything can be broken down into something smaller, technically. But that also means that the larger your scope and the broader your sight, the bigger your definition of oneness becomes. A city, a country, a planet, a star, a solar system, a galaxy. On a large enough scale, even a universe can be counted as one. In that case, if a universe is a perfectly closed system, wouldn't it too be in the life grade? Maybe it would be at a level within the life grade we can't fathom, but it would still be at that level regardless. In that case, could it too have its own personality? Lionel had concluded all of this in an instant, and that comprehension made him feel like he had been marked somehow. As though he was now being constantly monitored. It made his hairs stand on end. The latest _AP_SODIs are on _the website. Swoosh. Bang. Lionel's body increased by a size before being squeezed back down, the definition of his muscles seeming to only grow. Tier 5, the fifth dimension should have been far slower than the fourth, and in Lionel's case, it technically was. After all, he had leapt through the fourth dimension in a single bound. But that was only because he had practiced metal body first, something it had taken Lionel months to years of effort to reach any sort of accomplishment in. But his pace through the fifth dimension felt blazing. He wasn't even relying on like he could have. His mind was constantly evolving on its own without even much conscious effort. Lionel had a feeling that this had to be related to his king's might. Something about his will being tangible made breaking through these shackles feel exceptionally easy. One way or another, you would have been marked by the regulator. Your Scarlet Star Force innate node is basically a natural disaster waiting to happen. Just consider this an early initiation. I feel like we're missing the important topic at hand here. There's nothing more to say. Congratulations. You've learned about the glass ceiling. Feel free to feel despair, itll give me some sorely needed entertainment. You've been stuck in a bronze tablet for years, I'm sure you can do with some boredom. What do you know? The Luxnix family estate is always filled with drama. You'd be surprised how much fun you can have peeking into everyone's private lives. If you're a pervert, just say so, old man. Visit. For a better user experience, I'm not going to let an impotent virgin like you ruin my fun, brat. Lionel's lip twitched. Virgin was fair enough, but when did he become impotent? He had a ceiling tile with a hole through it to prove his point. You're one to talk. You couldn't even have sex with your own body even if you wanted to. Take that back. Oh, did I strike a nerve? Oh my, I'm shivering in my boots. I'm going to enjoy killing you. Why, so you can have sex with my body? You really are a pervert. Wise Star Order seemed to realize at this point that he was close to losing the war. How had he let Lionel catch onto one of his weaknesses like this? He had slipped up. Without a choice, he forced himself to change the subject. Just stop holding back your nodes, brat. The entire point of a nodes is to connect with your others. At this point, you're like a constipated middle-aged woman on menopause. You need to release. And now that you've waited so long, it's going to hurt like hell. Couldn't you have picked a better analogy? The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Chapter 1250. I need you to understand how horrible what you've done to your body is. Have you never held in a fart for too long? I don't understand how you don't feel uncomfortable all over. Plus, do you never sleep? How did you even manage to keep this up? Lionel frowned. He had never felt uncomfortable. Plus, even if he did, what was a little discomfort compared to being fried to ash by his own innate node? A part of him still somewhat believed that Wise Star Order was trying to trick him again. But, he deduced that that was unlikely. Also, it wasn't very difficult to manage this because he just set one of his minds to the task. You're pretty vulgar for an old man. Now that I think about it, I have 2 savants under my wing. You can train them. Wise Star Order had been too surprised today, so he had begun to think a measure before he spoke. Still, hearing that Lionel had 2 savants with him made him speechless again. Since when did his kind start to grow on trees? But, worst yet, what made Lionel think he could train them? He had his ability and they had their own. Plus, wasn't he afraid that Head used the savants to mess with him? The relationship between master and disciple was pretty special, and savants could either be much harder or much easier to manipulate than a normal human. He was playing a risky game here. What makes you think I can train them? Even if you don't have their abilities, I'm sure you have a deep understanding of what it means to grow powerful as a savant. Plus, you've seen a lot. What are their abilities? One has a spatial lock ability, the other has a defensive mirror ability. They both seem to be variations or mutations of known ability indexes, Vice with a spatial affinity ability index, and Candle with an energy shield ability index. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience. Lucky brats. Wise Star Order was jealous. If he had those abilities instead of his own, he would have been able to do great things. In the end, he shook his head. He wasn't naive enough to believe that was true. If he had been born with another ability, not only would he have lost his long lifespan, but he might not have been able to keep his abilities a secret. By then, he would have become a weapon of war for the Luxniks like so many other savants before him. Alright, I'll guide them. But don't blame me when they become more loyal to me than you. Lionel chuckled. What choice did he have? He was completely unequipped to care for savants, and the actions of his grandfather, though a risk mitigation measure, had made them only more unpredictable. Wise Star Order definitely wasn't normal, and he had his quirks. But, he still functioned within realms of reasons to certain predictable limits. He was on a spectrum, but it wasn't to the point Lionel couldn't understand him. Vice and Candle, however, were completely anti-social and couldn't properly interact with the world. They needed a mentor like Wise Star Order if they would be Lionel's guards in the future. Plus, what other option was there? At least he had a modicum of control over Wise Star Order. If he handed them to some teacher with unknown motives at the Void Palace, who knew what could happen? Lionel stood, arranging the containers. After he was done, he thought for a moment before pulling out a large basin 3/4 the height of a normal man. Then, he filled it up with cleansing waters. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, he thought that he should at least do this here and like this. If he was really going to die, then hopefully his mom and grandmother would be able to stabilize the situation. If he was within the segmented cube, who knew what might happen? That. Don't tell me, I've heard the spiel already. Just rip the band-aid off now. I use this water to flush my toilets. Good. Good. Now focus, I'm trying not to die here. Lionel threw his boxers to one side and hopped in, a cool and refreshing feeling hitting him from head to toe. Even after so long, 6-dimensional cleansing waters would never not feel soothing to an extreme. I need a new word for you. Idiot and fool doesn't seem to cut it. You have this kind of treasure and you don't even know how to use it. How are you supposed to use cleansing water properly if you've sealed off your nodes? It's through them you're supposed to take in the greatest benefits. Why are you using it like normal water? Wise Star Order had reached the point of shedding tears. He truly couldn't take it anymore. Lionel stopped listening to the old man. He had only brought out cleansing waters because they had an exceptionally high boiling point, and its specific heat made regular water look like a highly conductive metal. No need to overthink it. Just relax. Lionel slowly released control over his nodes, allowing force to flow through them naturally. He began very slowly, only going bit by bit. Even if this was the natural state of things, after so long doing things the wrong way, he didn't think that letting it go all at once would be a good thing. But then, the pain came. Visit. For a better user experience, a heart-tearing bloating began to push out from within him. Lionel grit his teeth, his skin beginning to glow a fierce red. But, just as that was happening, as though a sieve had been connected to the inside of his body, Lionel suddenly felt the cleansing waters around him drill into his pores and enter him. His mind was suddenly on full alert, but the feeling felt so good that his inhibitions seemed to all be released at once, an involuntary moan leaving his lips. Somehow, with timing blessed by the gods, the door to Lionel's penthouse suite opened at that moment. Lionel's and Anna's eyes met across space, but the former's face was still contorted with pleasure. With most of his body being submerged underwater, making it difficult to see much of anything outside the strong outline of his collarbone and upper chest, the situation was simply impossible to explain. Anna blinked and smiled lightly. Without a word, she went to the table and scooped up all of the containers into her arms. Her steps were elegant and unhurried, a radiant beauty beyond words exuding from her. Just the delicate fragrance she released alone was more enticing than even she could imagine. Her appearance only made it harder for Lionel to control how the cleansing waters were making him feel. For a moment, something within his lower belly truly did light on fire, though it was hard to tell if it was lust or his innate node trying to burn a hole through him. To Lionel, this was even worse than getting caught snuggling with Joel. He couldn't even find the words to speak. "I will bring you dinner later, you can focus on your relaxing." With a click, the door closed. Visit. For a better user experience. Chapter 1251. Wise Star Order was really his unlucky star. Lionel rarely experienced embarrassment in his life, and he definitely didn't feel it to a deep degree even when he did. But, now, this was already twice in just a few days he had. There was no coincidence, he blamed the old bastard. Unfortunately, he didn't get to linger on these thoughts for long because almost the exact instant Anna left once more, a loop of pain and relief seemed to take Lionel's life over completely. In the third dimension one formed their nodes, and the fourth not only did you strengthen the body, but you also forged nodal pathways. After the initial third dimension, there were only the bare bone connections between your 9 nodes, so it was up to the individual to complete what was essentially a new organ system. Lionel had, of course, done this long ago. He had spent many months in the dimensional cleanse trial world and had taken the time to finish there. But those new pathways had never been used at all. The good news was that as Lionel's body grew stronger, so did they. The bad news was that the sudden and novel feeling sent his body into a state of shock that was hard to recover from. When the pain reached its peak, the cleansing waters would cease to take action and Lionel would find himself on cloud 9, only for the pain to cycle back again. It was almost like having a pulsing migraine that tricked you into believing that it was gone every few minutes, only for it to come back the moment you shifted your head the slightest bit. All this time, Wise Star Order had completely tuned Lionel out. Even now, he was in a state of shock. Stealing energy from the regulator. They always theorized that this was the only way past the glass ceiling, but no one had ever succeeded. It really took a brat who didn't know the word fear to do it. How many geniuses are rolling in their graves right now? Visit. For a better user experience, Wise Star Order knew Lionel had done it completely by accident. Or had he? His father, Wise Star Order's gaze narrowed. Was it really luck? He had never heard of someone being able to regrow an innate node. From the very beginning, an innate node wasn't something normal people should have. This was why a birth was followed by a phenomena. If Lionel's father wasn't as powerful as he was, Lionel would have been smited the moment he was born. Innate nodes were already at the limit of the regulator's tolerance, and that was especially so for Scarlet Star Force in specific. So the question was, how the hell could you regrow such a thing? There's one more variable in all of this that I didn't consider. I dismissed it because he called it something as ridiculous as a vomit brew, but what if the trigger for this wasn't his stupidity, but rather his father's genius? Regrowing an innate node should be impossible. But, if I had to speculate about one thing that would be capable of doing so, it would be the energy of the regulator. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Wise Star orders mind spun. He was a man who had seen so much of the world, and yet he still had fear for Lionel's father. After all the crap he had spoken about how weak the human domain was, he still felt this way. Lionel was simply unaware of the kind of man his father really was, and what it was that he represented. As the hours waned, Lionel's labored breathing didn't seem to slow. True to her word, Aina did return with dinner as dusk approached, but when she saw Lionel still unmoving, her brows furrowed lightly. By this point, the basin which had once been filled with clear water was now filled with a thick, violet liquid that gave off a foul smell that had ruined the ambience of the entire room. Aina was instantly able to tell that it was impurities and waste. But, that should have been completely black. This dark purple didn't make sense. But then it hit her. Blood. Lionel had actually bled to the point of turning the entire basin of water from a pitch black to a dark violet. She had no idea what he was doing, but a tinge of worry couldn't help but flicker in her eyes. Aina used her blood force affinity to form Lionel's blood into a vessel to shuttle the water and impurities out. It was only at that point that she noticed that Lionel had actually been using cleansing waters, something that only left her more baffled. Cleansing waters were among the purest substances in all of existence. Even when her curse was acting up, it had evaporated in these waters as though it had never been there. Logically, with the self-cleaning ability of cleansing waters, something like what was happening now shouldn't have been possible. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Still, Aina didn't stall. She found the segmented cube to the side and filled the basin with cleansing waters once more. After another look toward Lionel, she left silently. Maybe she didn't even realize how unbothered and unfazed she had been by his naked body. What neither Aina nor Lionel knew at this point was that Wise Star Order was truly speechless by this point. He could hardly wrap his head around just how lucky this body was. He should have known that stealing energy from the regulator wasn't so simple. It seemed that there had indeed been ill effects. However, because Lionel made the choice to seal his nodes away, it had never taken deep root. That foul energy that was able to make even cleansing waters murky was known as anarchic force. Though it had a name that could be considered quite interesting, it was nothing but a death sentence. Anarchic force didn't follow the laws of the universe as it should. It was considered to be the throwaway force of the universe, the force that had no use other than to take up space, stir chaos, and act as a leech. In the simplest terms possible, it was unusable energy and it was a cancer. All force tended toward anarchic force, and there were even theories that once all force had reached this state, the universe itself would die. For a force user, having this stuff in your body was like a human suffering radiation poison. Damn it. I missed another chance to kill him. Visit. For a better user experience. Chapter 1252. It took Lionel several days before he could feel something outside a perpetual cycle of pain. Even the soothing effect of his cleansing water only made the torture worse because it continued to remind him of what it felt like to not experience heartrending pain day in and day out. When it finally came to a stop, Lionel's body felt so weak that he directly fell asleep again, unable to move. He didn't know that he had another close shave with death, nor did he know about anarchic force. All he knew was that he needed sleep. And hopefully food when he woke up. Lionel didn't feel particularly good when his eyes finally opened once more. It felt like a cross between him having slept for too long and yet somehow not enough. His head was foggy and his body felt as though it had been put through hours of torture. Though. That was exactly what had happened. I feel like crap. Lionel shook his head, his eyes taking much longer to adjust to the light than it should have. He realized he was naked, but he was far too lazy to do anything about it. Just moving his limbs around made him feel as though he had torn every muscle fiber in his body. For the first time in a while, he didn't even feel immediately hungry either. After so long suppressing himself, this was an inevitable reality Lionel was forced to face. It was as though he had let a wound scab over, but had now picked it clean once again to allow it to heal properly. Visit. For a better user experience. Despite this, though, Lionel felt an overwhelming power rushing through his veins. It took him a while to register it because of how crappy he felt. But, once he did, he suddenly couldn't take his mind off of it. It had practically consumed him. This much. To Lionel's surprise, the largest change wasn't even to his force and force nodes. Rather, it was to his metal body and metal synergy lineage factor. What Lionel hadn't realized was that his metal synergy lineage factor was like a separate organ system all to its own as well. The runes that grew across his body could be considered to be manifestations of said organ system. However, this organ system was special in that it could be activated and deactivated. While in its deactivated state, it was much weaker and as such, Lionel's body was far more susceptible to harm than it would be otherwise. This was why Lionel's defenses were so much greater when his bronze runes were visible. What Lionel had never considered was the mechanism behind this. When one thought about it, didn't Lionel's defenses come from his metal body? Since that was a technique he trained in, why did it matter whether his bronze runes were activated or not? The answer to that question lied in the method by which the metal synergy lineage factor circumvented many of the weaknesses that usually came with defense lineage factors like heavy weight, slow speed, and low flexibility. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, the bronze runes were an amplification measure that relied on force to synergize with Lionel's metal body and bring out its true strength while not hampering him as much as other lineage factors would. To make something that was extraordinarily complex, simple. Lionel's bronze runes needed his nodal organ system to display their full potential. Why was it that the Morales clan elders had freaked out when Lionel tried to awaken his metal synergy lineage factor before forming all 9 of his nodes? It was precisely because this foundation was extraordinarily important towards setting a wielder of the metal synergy lineage factor up for success. Lionel raised his hand to his face. A slight discomfort and a bloated feeling coursed through him as he activated his bronze runes on it. And, after just a moment of observation, he sucked in a cold breath. My metal body now with my bronze runes deactivated is about as strong as it was before with runes. And now, with my bronze runes activated in full force, my defenses are 3 to 5 times greater than they had been before. If before Lionel could match up to lower tier and lower quality 5th dimension weapons in hardness with his bronze runes activated, now it wouldn't be guaranteed that even a quasi 6th dimensional blade could harm him. Wow, the latest _AP_SODIs are on _the website. Lionel had always been underwhelmed by his Tier 9 metal body. He had used the silver tablet to accelerate his progress toward it, but he never felt the sort of invincibility it should have. People seemed to be able to harm him far too easily, and the gap between him and Miguel still felt difficult to bridge. Lionel had dismissed this odd feeling of his because he was used to his metal body being weaker than normal. Back when he was in the 3rd dimension, his 4th dimensional metal body was also lacking. So, he had just assumed that it was because his dimension tier was lagging behind it once again. He didn't realize until now that he was shooting himself in the foot. The metal synergy lineage factor in conjunction with the technique represented the strongest defensive lineage factor in the whole of the human domain. There was no other that came even close. The Morales were untouchable in this aspect. With a Tier 9 metal body and his bronze runes activated, considering the fact Lionel had opened all 9 nested doorways of the 5th dimension, harming him should have been an extraordinarily difficult task. To explain things as simply as possible. To the current Lionel, unless you could display 6th dimensional strength, you should forget about leaving even the slightest mark on his skin so long as his bronze runes were activated. It was as simple as that. Lionel tried to take a deep breath, but his heart and lungs protested almost immediately. He settled for more shallow breathing, his eyes looking toward empty space. Somehow, this only felt like the tip of the iceberg. Just what else had he missed out on? Just 2 today, everyone, sprints away. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. Chapter 1253. The next change Lionel felt was to his brain activity. Lionel's intelligence was always a fairly unique thing and didn't exactly work like everyone else's did. According to Lionel's father, Lionel's ability had awoken long before everyone else of Earth. This was because Lionel had been born on planet Luxnix and not Earth like his mother had been. For his own reasons, Velasco had sealed Lionel away, restricting him from accessing his ability too soon. This was exactly why the force distribution during the awakening had only left such a small sliver for Lionel. He didn't need to be given his ability as he already had it. However, even sealed, Lionel's intelligence had still been beyond most. Though, not as exaggerated as it was now. Lionel had been in Class A of Royal Blue Academy, a great feat, but he had been third in his class, behind Aina and Alan. There were maybe a few reasons for this, but the main reason was because of the Ascension Empire's restrictions on books and knowledge. Lionel wasn't allowed to return with his books home as he lived on a paradise island, and as such, he didn't get nearly as much time to study as others who lived on campus. But, even with this being true, the reality was that things just didn't click as easily for Lionel then as they did now. He was always lacking in something, and that was greatly related to his ability. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. In the dimensional verse, there could be considered to be 2 roots of intelligence. The first was the soul and the second was the brain. The 2 interacted with one another through the ethereal glabella, which could also be considered to be part of the brain, as it was located in the prefrontal cortex of human anatomy. Due to his father, Lionel had lost his connection with his ethereal glabella. As such, he was left with just his brain, leaving him on the same playing field as everyone else. Or so it seemed. The main issue here is that Lionel's brain was fundamentally different from the brains of everyone else on Earth. The spear domain lineage factor rearranged the neural connectivity in his cortex, giving him different anatomy than one would expect to find in a person of Earth. While most people of Earth had a prefrontal cortex designed purely for higher-level functioning, thought and reasoning, Lionel's own was wired for battle with a spear. The amount of energy allocated to this much more complex interconnectivity left little to the rest of Lionel's mind. And, on top of that, his lineage factor hadn't even awoken then, so it was like a continuous siphon of energy toward a bottomless pit of uselessness. And, as though that wasn't bad enough, he didn't have his ethereal glabella, which would have been the best power source for it all. It quite literally made Lionel dumber. But why was it that this was all important now? After all, Lionel's ethereal glabella was just fine, and now that he could use dream force, the fuel his brain had was far beyond that of 99% of most people. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. The important thing to consider here is that the brain and the soul had a dependency on one another. Neither was more important than the other. Lionel just so happened to have had a force node in his brain stem that had been muted all this time, only for it to suddenly be flooded with energy. It was at that moment that Lionel realized his groggy mind wasn't only because of all the pain he had experienced. He quite literally had a concussion right now, and quite a severe one at that. Using his brain stem as a root, while within the 4th dimension, Lionel had taken advantage to route countless nodal pathways through his brain, and now they were all swollen and made his head feel as though it might explode at any moment. And yet, Lionel felt that his mind was on a completely different level than it had ever been. Without even checking, Lionel felt that his number of split minds had increased tenfold. From 10 million, he could control over 100 million now, and he wasn't even sure if that was the limit or an artificial cap he didn't dare to blow by because this migraine was hunting after his life. The largest change other than this was in Lionel's control ability. It had to be remembered that Tier 4 of Lionel's ability index was control. This tier represented a perfect control over one's body, far greater than most could exhibit. This was the tier Lionel's dream sense technique came from, allowing him to dull his senses to mute pain or maximize his sleep by spreading it across numerous minds. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience right this moment, Lionel felt that his control tier had taken an enormous step forward. Even with the foggy state of his mind, he felt he could accelerate and decelerate his heart on a whim. He could quicken his digestion by diverting energy toward it. He even felt that he could grasp signals his neurons were firing toward his mind before they even made it to his brain. It was as though his entire body had become a hive mind. And, if Lionel's deductions were correct, once the swelling of his brain went down and he could finally think clearly again, he might even be able to reach down a cellular level. He didn't think it would be easy, and it would definitely require large amounts of focus and energy, but if he could pull that off, the possibilities were endless. He would be able to direct his passive healing factor towards specific regions to accelerate cell regrowth even faster. He might be able to take control of his stem cells to regrow limbs or circumvent injuries his healing factor alone wouldn't be able to handle. He would be able to change the composition of his muscle so they could exhibit more power per fiber length than they could in the past. And, the largest elephant in the room, he might truly be able to reach a point where he could improve and modify his lineage factors. Of course, Lionel had learned how naive he was to even think of doing so in the past. But, this really did open up that door once again. The prowess of the control tier of his ability index was something he had clearly greatly underestimated until this point. None of this even touched the fact that Lionel felt as though his spear domain lineage factor was clearer to him now than it ever had been in the past. Even his breakthrough against Miguel didn't make things feel this obvious and compatible with him. Visit. For a better user experience with force coursing through his brain, his spear domain lineage factor mutations finally got the sort of support it was always meant to, making him feel as though he couldn't bear to use any weapon outside of a spear, like it would be a waste of his ability to even spend time doing so. And yet, it still felt like there was more, as though he was still seeing just the tip of the iceberg. Chapter 1254. With the distribution of his nodes, Lionel realized that the control he had over his body was amplified many times over. If he wanted to control his digestion, he had a node there that could be used. If he wanted to control his heart, he had another 2 nodes there. If he wanted to control his blood and purify it, he had his kidneys. Even if he wanted to breathe better and react faster, he had nodes in his lungs and spine. It wasn't until now Lionel truly grasped how good his decisions from back then were. At the very least, his simulations had not failed him and had only proven to be more accurate, an outright miracle considering just how many things he had gotten wrong. The only shame here was that even Lionel's passive healing factor was taking forever to bring him back up to speed, and he didn't even have the energy to move. He couldn't even enjoy his improvements. It just felt like his body was collapsing. He knew he needed food, but he couldn't even stand right now, let alone eat. Plus, he wasn't sure if his stomach could even handle a high dose of food right now because it was among the places in his body that he had flooded with nodal pathways. Lionel had half a mind to use dream sense to induce a coma in himself until he could wake up, but his better judgment made him decide against it. Who knew if there are other twists waiting for him? Though wise Star Order hadn't explained, Lionel could feel that there was something odd in his body. Part of the reason he had pushed himself so far was to ensure he had gotten it all out, but what had scared him was that even with his senses, he hadn't been able to detect it. That mysterious black force. It was as though it wasn't there at all. Even when it was floating around Lionel like it had been, even when he could see it with his own eyes, it was as though it was nothing more than a figment of his imagination. The latest _AP_SODIes are on _ the website. What was that thing? Lionel's voice came out hoarse. It had no oomph to it at all, making it seem like it had been stripped of all of its base. Anarchic force. Lionel didn't answer for a long while, almost as though he was searing the fear he had felt for that force in his mind. It seemed capable of swallowing everything. If not for the cleansing waters neutralizing it somewhat, he didn't know what he would have done. I don't know how my Scarlet Star Force can embody destruction if that thing exists. Wise Star Order shook his head. It doesn't destroy. It consumes and erases. At least when you're destroyed, some semblance of what you once were remains. Broken pieces, ash, a mark in the land. When anarchic force moves through, it leaves nothing but the void. The void battlefields are filled with that stuff, aren't they? Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience Wise Star Order was taken aback. How'd you guess that? Lionel wanted to shrug, but he didn't have the strength to, nor did he want to experience the pain that came with it. His dreamscape had drawn the conclusion for him. The speed his mind worked at now was leagues beyond where it had been in the past. I felt like your choice of the word void wasn't coincidence. Plus, if there was anything that could weaken my ability with its presence alone, it feels like anarchic force, is it? Your ability is probably something bestowed upon you by the regulator, right? And I assumed that the only way for that force to have gotten into my body without my knowledge was as some sort of retaliation by the regulator. So, making the leap wasn't too difficult. Wise Star Order shook his head. This brat got smarter. How annoying. You shouldn't think of the regulator as a person. Why not? Visit. For a better user experience, Lionel didn't refute his ancestor. He realized after Wise Star Order said it he had subconsciously begun to think of the regulator as a singular existence. Because it's the pinnacle of arrogance to do so. Lionel chuckled, but it quickly turned into a wheezing, coughing hybrid. You laugh, but that's only because you know it's true. Personifying the will of the universe is just a coping mechanism. It makes you think that you can defeat it and overcome it, when in reality, it gave birth to all that is. The comprehensions you've grasped are all innately known by it, the abilities you're bestowed are created by it, the force you use to strengthen yourself are produced by it. Even if it was a person, it would be something beyond a god. The quicker you learn that, the greater chance you'll have to live. A rare solemn tone came from Wise Star Order. He was usually deciding between losing his mind and picking which insult to throw at Lionel next, but this time, he was as serious as he could be. Lionel fell into a deep silence, his mind wandering from place to place but always seeming to return back to Wise Star Order's words. The silence between the two lasted hours, and maybe even Wise Star Order himself thought that Lionel had just accepted his words and left things alone. The light of day waned and Aina even came once again. Seeing the situation that Lionel was in, she seemed to be able to tell exactly what he needed at a glance and prepared it. There was a delicate sort of silence between the two as she fed Lionel spoonfuls of soup, not even giving him the chance to reject her kind intentions. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. Once she was finished, she smiled and left the room even as the lights of dusk finally faded to black. And it was only then that Lionel spoke words froze Wise Star Order completely. If I unite the dimensional verse and make the power the regulator bestows meaningless, wouldn't I be the regulator then? Chapter 1255. Wise Star Order finally realized this kid was insane. This was why the distinguishment between whether Lionel understood, or if he truly understood, was so important. Wise Star Order was certain that it was the latter. Lionel knew exactly what he was facing, and even took as much as half a day to think about it, and those were the first words he had said. He was a madman. It's the Scarlet Star Force innate node, it has to be. Only someone born with that thing could be so clinically insane. I might not even get a chance to live out the rest of my life in peace. This kid is going to be the death of me. Lionel fell asleep not long after he spoke those words, leaving Wise Star Order to wallow in his own sorrow. The days continued to pass and Lionel felt a bit better day by day. He had no idea that their return to Void Palace had been delayed because of him. Once again, his mother put her son first and ignored everything else. While this would be fine for the selection, the return to Void Palace was a bit more complex. It was suffice to say that there'd be quite a few unsatisfied people when the time came. But the current Lionel was still oblivious to the coming danger. Regardless, Alienor would never allow Lionel to go out and fight in such a state. Even if it took a year, they could wait until her son was ready. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. Alright, old bastard. Don't you think it's about time you told me what you've been hiding about the bronze tablet? Wise Star Order snorted. What makes you think I've hidden anything? I'm sure you have. You had to play the part of helpless elder. It was a bad choice if you asked me. If you gave me knowledge beyond the scope of the bronze tablet, I would have been more inclined to believe you. But, then again, too much knowledge and I would have suspected you anyway. It's all because I didn't think you'd be so stupid. If I knew you were so ignorant to the ways of the dimensional verse, you think I'd waste my time? I could have pulled a book of fantasy from my ass and fed it to you and you would have believed it. Lionel's lip twitched, but he didn't refute. Wise Star Order was probably right, at least in part. Just start with the simple stuff. Are there really only 3 beasts? Is there nothing after the starry-tailed fox? And tell me what you really know about its lineage factor and how it works. So greedy. You haven't even mastered one yet, but you're concerned about the others. Lionel shook his head. In these last few days, even without going to the bronze tablet, I've felt all my bottlenecks loosen. If I wasn't holding them back for fear for what they'd do to my body, I probably would have cleared all 3rd awakenings for all 3 branches by now and maybe even touched upon the 4th. With Lionel released his nodes and nodal pathways, the purifying effect his kidneys had on his blood had shot up astronomically. Because his snowy star owl lineage factor was located in his blood, the synergy of the 2 events was ridiculously high. Lionel didn't even feel he needed to take the bronze tablet with him. Wise Star Order could only roll his eyes. Where was his thank you? This brat had no respect. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. The bronze tablet is more than just about increasing the pace of awakening. Without it, you wouldn't be able to feel the gateway to the next lineage factor even if you awakened it fully. In addition, most of the techniques of the Luxnix, including our Force Art system, are just derivative and fragmented understandings that come from the bronze tablet. Lionel's eyes lit up. So you mean I don't have to form techniques from the ground up? No. So long as you have enough comprehension, it shouldn't be a problem. This was a huge sigh of relief for Lionel. This was one of the things he had felt the most worried about. Then the starry-tailed fox? Lionel asked. I lied back then. The starry-tailed fox doesn't have 4 branches. Rather, it has the standard 3 the snowy star owl and the white stone elephant had. Instead, it's just that its wisdom branch evolves into something more profound and becomes the wisdom spirit branch. So, it has the speed branch, the healing branch, and finally the wisdom spirit branch, each with 4 awakenings of their own. What's so different about it? Why do you care so much now? You're nowhere close to it. I'm probably closer than you think. Just answer the question, old man. From what I can tell, the wisdom spirit branch is heavily related to the soul. You've seen what benefits sensing your soul for the first time gave you. It'll be similar but likely manifold more potent. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. I see. Lionel nodded. Then there's probably evolutions of healing branch waiting in the future, right? It's the only one that appears just as frequently as the wisdom branch. Even I don't know the answer to that. I only have vague information about the next 2. Oh. What are they? The twinkling light bear and the golden tiger. The bear sounds like another strength-based creature, similar to the elephant. Likely yes. If it alternates between speed and strength like this, there's probably a reason. I just don't know what it is. 5 feel incomplete. Lionel suddenly said. The silver tablet I saw, though I could only meditate on it for a moment, definitely only had 2 creatures within it. There wasn't another. Is there a golden tablet? Lionel asked. I am uncertain. The only other tablet I've ever seen was yours, but it seems to function very differently from the lineage factor tablets. Visit. For a better user experience, what I can say is that you are likely right. 5 is incomplete. If there are these creatures, and each has their own shadow, then I would have to guess that there are 12 total, 1 for each point of the northern star, so there's a 6th. Wise Star Order confirmed. Chapter 1256. Lionel wasn't too surprised by this. Quite frankly, whether there were 5 or 6 hardly mattered to him. The only reason a 6th would be an intriguing prospect if its power was truly beyond that of the golden tiger. According to Wise Star Order, the starry-tailed fox was already considered to be at the pinnacle of 7th dimension. What about this golden tiger? And what about this mysterious 7th beast? Lionel was definitely intrigued. What dimensional level were they at? It's a similar pattern. The twinkling light bear was 8th dimensional. The golden tiger was most definitely pinnacle of the 8th dimension. As for the other details, I'm not sure. You found this in the domain of the spirituals? Wise Star Order laughed. Brat, in other domains, humans unlucky enough to be there are treated no differently from slaves. A lot of time, they quite literally are a slave class. You going over there is no different from giving your life away. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, you wouldn't even be able to step foot in the region something so precious would be held, let alone making it to the point of laying your eyes on it. Lionel frowned. Slaves? Oh. Are you mad? You should get over that hero's complex really quick. That nonsense you said about uniting the dimensional verse is never going to happen. Your domain is just lucky that it mostly produces humans thanks to the regulator you apparently want to replace. If not, humans wouldn't even have a place in the universe. I feel like you're exaggerating. Anyone with half a brain knows how evolution works. For a race to survive so long into the lifespan of the universe, and even control a domain all to itself, it can't possibly be weak, or else it would have been rooted out a long time ago. But you're making it sound like humans have no redeeming qualities. Humans do have redeeming qualities. Too many, in fact. But that's the problem. There's no universal path for humans to take, so instead of putting all your efforts toward excavating one thought, you all diverge. There's no greater example of this than the lineage factor. How many lineage factors are in the human domain? Hundreds? Thousands? Millions is probably the more accurate denomination. Each of you is trying to figure out how a different path works, diverging along countless lines of evolutions, instead of streamlining it all into one large and cohesive effort. When I say humans are untalented and are far behind everyone else, I don't mean that there's a literal objective metric by which you're worthless. It's the insatiable appetite of humans and their neutral foundations that ruin everything. Visit. For a better user experience, humans can be great at everything, and that's exactly why they're great at nothing. Lionel frowned. He felt that Wise Star Order was speaking the truth, and he could feel that it made perfect sense. But, even with his improved thinking speed and computational ability, he couldn't even begin to guess at how to unravel that problem and solve it. The Void Palace is maybe the only decent attempt humans have made to form a cohesive ideology. It helps geniuses worth investing in to focus in on the God path. Though there are plenty of powerful individuals who've taken the conventional path, there's a reason that the God path is still conventionally known as the better of the two. However, even that's become a shit show. There's only so many resources you're all willing to pool into a neutral party that will take away from your own strength, so there's limited spots. And because the spots are limited, only the extremely talented even have a chance to claim a spot for themselves. Once they get into the place, they'll be bombarded with politics and bullshit from all sides. Unless you're both talented and come from a strong family, you'll find yourself rattling within someone else's cage soon enough. If by some miracle they manage to make it through all of that and reach the highest echelons, they'll become another useless old fogey sitting on their high horse thinking themselves to be invincible because they reached the peak of the human domain. Or, they'll end up siphoning most of the resources they earned back to their families to fuel more diverging paths into the future. Even if you sat humans down and tried to explain this, they wouldn't listen. How would you even decide which lineage factors to abandon and which to focus on for the good of the whole human race? And, even if you could decide, would that family agree to share their lineage factor with everyone? Why should they share? If their lineage factor was the best, shouldn't you all just submit? Visit. For a better user experience, Wise Star Order seemed to be very passionate about this matter, to the point it even brought a smile to Lionel's face. Though the old man called his dream ridiculous, judging by how much effort he had put into making sure the Luxnix family would follow his lead into the future, it was likely that, at one point, he shared a dream not too dissimilar to his own. It's not the humans are so much more stupid or selfish than other races. Every race is selfish and is out for their own selves. The difference is that most of the races are only good at one or two things, so all of their lineage factors converge toward the same evolutionary peak. But this isn't a luxury humans have. But if you know your weakness, then you should try harder than others to fix it. Fuck. I hate stupid people. Wise Star Order ended up ranting to himself. He had riled himself up so completely that he completely forgot about Lionel entirely. Once Earth enters the 8th dimension, it's all over. All these years of wasting time and shilling for their own personal gain is going to end with the human race being completely wiped out and enslaved. But all they're worried about is conquering a piece of Earth for themselves. Useless piles of trash, I'd kill them all if I have the chance. Lionel erupted into a fit of laughter. He forgot about the pain in his body for a moment, laughing to his heart's content. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. What are you laughing about, you damned brat? When you're not trying to kill me, you're kind of adorable, old man. Chapter 1257. The click of Lionel's hotel room door sounded as it closed once more. Ana's lingering fragrance still hung by his bedside. He had already lost count of the number of times she had fed him over these last few weeks. Though he was baffled that it was taking him this long to heal, he was even more baffled by her persistence. The two hadn't even exchanged a single word in all this time. She didn't try to speak with him about anything, and it felt as though she had said all the words she wanted to say that day. She wasn't asking for anything, so Lionel didn't even have something to reject. And he was stuck in bed like this and hardly had the strength to lift a single finger, and clearly his mother and grandmother had some sort of tacit understanding to avoid this room at all costs. It should have been them nursing him back to health, but here he was in this awkward situation. His advancement in brain power seemed to be no help solving. Why haven't you fucked her already? What a waste of heaven's treasures. Lionel choked on air, some of his saliva going down the wrong pipe. This old man only ever spoke when he initiated conversation. This was the first time he had spoken of his own accord, and it completely disrupted Lionel's flow of thoughts, and he actually decided to say something like that. Lionel didn't even participate in these sorts of conversations with his brothers. Though James had quite the vulgar mouth and never held back when explaining the dirty deeds he got up to, James and he had always had a tacit understanding that Ana was a taboo. Lionel had never tolerated anyone sexualizing the woman he had once loved more than he could describe in words. Once. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Lionel winced, his migraine coming back due to his sudden jolt and coughing spree. Can't you act your age for once? You're just a soul, why do you even have a libido? What do you know, brat? The greatest intimacy you can have is with the soul. Sex with fleshly bodies pales in comparison to the sex I've had with some spirituals' beauties. Your scope is too limited. As if they would have sex with human trash like you. Lionel chortled. Wet dreams don't count no matter how vivid they are, old man. Die. All I'm saying is that you're missing out. A domain would probably only have a handful of seedlings like her. Every generation would be capped at 3 or 4 at best. Oh. Is she that talented? What talent? I'm talking about beauty, damn it. Lionel was speechless. Was this really a man who had lived for thousands of years? Where was the maturity? Where was the level-headedness? Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ing experience, I really don't know what to say. Don't say anything, just do. Actually, you don't have to do anything, just lie there. She'll probably be willing to do everything. I don't know how an idiot like you could get so lucky, but I'm going to have an aneurysm if you let her walk in here without saying anything again. You don't even have to marry her, just claim the land as yours. What's wrong with you, are you even a man? Lionel felt a headache coming on. He made a mental note that if he ever was with a woman in the future, he would definitely throw this old man somewhere under lock and key. This old pervert would definitely watch if he had the chance. I'm ignoring you. What do you know? It makes sense for a man like your dad to gain your mother, but what are you exactly? You need to claim her while she hasn't seen the rest of the world yet. Lionel coughed. Why do you keep talking about my dad like you're in love with him? There's nothing good about that old prankster. If Lionel could see Wise Star Order's face right now, it would be bright red. It seemed he had struck another nerve, but his head was throbbing too much to notice. Stop changing the subject, I am being serious. How are you going to lay claim to the dimensional verse if you don't have a woman of that caliber by your side? The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. Lionel really wanted to roll his eyes, but just opening their lids flooded him with too much sunlight. And there wasn't much of a point if they were closed to begin with. First this old man called his dream ridiculous, now he was talking about something completely unrelated to it. You're just saying stuff now. Go back to calling me an idiot. Wise Star Order shook his head. He had been mostly joking around in the beginning, but seeing that Lionel was really so ignorant about these matters, he became more serious. It seems you're still too immature, brat. You're not bad at reading a person one-on-one, but you're lacking the ability to see things on a grand scale. Lionel raised an eyebrow. He had the whole of Valiant Heart Mountain dancing on his palm years ago. He was just fine at manipulating emotions on a large scale. Their entire organization had almost collapsed because of him. A beautiful woman, especially one on the level of a generational goddess, is more than what she appears on the surface. She's a status symbol. When men see you with her, they respect you. When women see you with her, they want to be her. There's no empire created in history that wasn't built off the back of a royal family. The people won't have trust in the empire unless it has a lineage and a future generation. You can't build anything on that scale by yourself, you'd be naive to think that you could. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience. Lionel blinked. The old man did have a point, but that was only something to worry about after the empire was actually built. Plus, are you sure about that? Whenever men see me with her, they actually want to kill me and take her for themselves. Chapter 1258. Lionel laughed to himself when he had this thought. It really wasn't much of an exaggeration, actually. In fact, it was entirely true. He hadn't spent long with this version of Aina by his side. Not long after he had cured her curse back to a level she could manage herself, they entered the Valiant Zone and found themselves separated. Then, after they got out, they were thrust into the situation with the other organizations, and the rest went about as poorly as one could imagine. But, even in that short time, Lionel realized that Aina was always the center of attention when he was around without even trying. That was just the way the world worked, unfortunately. It was a sort of double-edged sword for both men and women. On one side, there were men who, no matter how handsome they were, had to find their worth in either their personal strength or their wealth. In most cases, a woman wouldn't choose a man purely based on looks in a world like the dimensional verse where your death could be lingering around the next corner. Lionel himself was fairly handsome. Maybe not as handsome as Wise Star Order or Elther, but that was mostly because he dressed down a lot of the time, hadn't had a haircut he didn't slice with his own blade in years, and couldn't be bothered to worry about useless stuff like looks. However, even then, he could be considered to be within the top percentile of men, and practically no one gave a damn. On the other hand, there were women who, no matter how talented and strong they were still measured by how much beauty they were born with. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. Lionel had seen this all too often with Aina before her curse had been cured. She was no less powerful than himself, and even more so during most points in their journey. In fact, before his fight with Miguel, Lionel was certain that he could defeat him, but he had no idea if he could do the same with Aina. Maybe only now that his nodes were being used properly could he say that he had a good chance at beating her. And yet, all anyone seemed to talk about was how ugly she had been or how beautiful she was now. When Lionel said he didn't care about Anna's beauty, he had meant it. That wasn't to say that he wasn't enthralled by it, he was a man, after all. It was just that beauty alone wasn't able to move his needle one way or another. Maybe considering his logical brain, he should be going after the most beautiful woman possible to maximize the good genes his offspring could have. But, Lionel had always felt that a healthy family had to have foundations beyond this. Wise Star Order shook his head. That's because you lack status. You can't have a symbol like that by your side and be a weakling. Can you stop calling her a symbol already? She's a human being. Oh. Are you mad? Wise Star Order laughed. I thought you didn't want her. That doesn't mean I have to allow her to be disrespected. Visit. For a better user experience, what a foolish little brat. I don't know what I'm going to do with you. How about you be useful and tell me why the universal cycles are ordered the way they are? It makes no sense. What? What are you confused about? Don't tell me you've never thought it was weird either. Wouldn't it feel better if the order was natural light, for seasons, heavenly body, constellation, and then finally the cosmos realm? Why is it 4 seasons, heavenly body, natural light, cosmos, then constellation? It feels like someone shuffled it into the order then made the least amount of sense. Wise Star Order didn't know what to say for a long time. First this kid all but threw down a gauntlet to face the regulator, now he was doubting a power system that had been the same since the beginning of time. Did he think that things could just be like this by accident? It was like Lionel went out of his way to make him think that he was crazy. Day after day of this stuff. He might as well go back to being tortured by Lionel's Scarlet Star Force because the shaving down of his lifespan was about the same anyway. The names of the universal cycles don't just represent the complexity of the event itself, they represent the inherent importance of the events as well. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. You seem to think that the night, day, dusk and dawn are lesser than spring, summer, winter and fall. But, is that true? Night, day, dusk and dawn are constants, or relative constants. No matter what world you're on, they will appear in some form. However, how many places can you think of where only a single season is experienced? There are many places where a shift between summer and winter has no meaning whatsoever. Are the 4 seasons still beyond the cycle of light then? Lionel's brow furrowed, not answering immediately. But aren't there places where there's only day as well? If I go to the North Pole of Earth, the sun rarely sets. It can go months without experiencing night. And then there's planet Luxnix. Isn't it always day here too? This 3-planet rotation is an artificial construct, it isn't part of nature's will. It's just a representation of 3 greedy families who didn't want to allow any of the others to have a leg up. Lionel's brows shot up. You can move planets? You've been to the Dimensional Cleanse trial world and have seen the Dyson sphere, but you're surprised by this? I really don't know what goes on in that head of yours. Lionel felt that Wise Star Order had a point. It seemed that he was still stuck in the mind frame of an Earthling. If even Earth could terraform their continents and move them about as they please, why wouldn't far higher dimensional worlds have methods of moving entire planets? The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. But still. Lionel mumbled. The rest doesn't click with me. Chapter 1259. For example, even if I accept that you're right about night, day, dusk and dawn, what about the others? Why would natural light be deemed as above heavenly bodies? And why would a constellation be beyond a cosmos? Are you doubting me? If I can give you an explanation for one of them, what makes you think I don't have explanations for the others? Much like the 4 seasons, heavenly bodies come in a lot of shapes and forms. There is nothing inherently special about them. Technically, the only difference between an asteroid, a moon, a planet and a star is in their mass. They all have the same beginnings, give or take a few differences. The heavenly bodies you're in awe of are an extraordinarily small portion of them. Most are useless hunks of rock with nothing special about them in the slightest. The fact their name is so grandiose and fantastical is almost a slap in the face of things that would truly be worthy of such names. Even a step further, just how easy is it to bend so-called heavenly bodies to your own whim? Your people of Earth could already terraform your planet and your moon, you could already excavate asteroids and strip them of their resources. And, though you couldn't form Dyson spheres of your own yet, you've seen for yourself how possible such a thing is. There's nothing more special about it than natural light. Lionel's brow furrowed. But aren't concepts of night and day, not to mention the seasons, anchored to the existence of heavenly bodies? Aren't they contingent on their existence? That right there is your main problem. You're conflating the artistic conception of something with its logical existence in the real world. That isn't the purpose of universal cycle comprehension. Visit. For a better user experience, but aren't you doing the same thing to prove me wrong? There's a subtle difference between what you and I are doing. I'm trying to frame things in a way you can understand, but my foundation is still the artistic conception. Your foundation, however, is whatever scientific understanding you have of these things. When I say the four seasons realm is weak is because it's so fleeting and can appear in a myriad of different ways depending, you see it from the frame of science. The location of the planet, how far it is away from its star, its tilt, etc. However, I'm speaking of its artistic conception. Winter, to a myriad of people, represents different things. Many have never even seen snow before. Some have never seen anything but snow. Many more don't understand the mild transition of spring or the slow death of fall either. Because so many don't understand, the artistic conception lacks and ubiquitousness. However, there isn't a single person who doesn't understand what night and day is. Do you see the difference? Lionel's gaze flickered. So this concept of artistic conception was far broader than he originally understood. It wasn't just about how he viewed things, but it was also important to grasp how others viewed it as well. What gave the universal cycles power was the universe itself. Lionel's own perspective wasn't the most important here even though he became the conduit by which it took root and flourished. He had to look at things from the perspective of the whole. Visit. For a better user experience, sparks flew within Lionel's dreamscape. A vague line connecting dream force, artistic conception, his own thoughts and that of those around him threatened to erupt. It felt like it was on the tip of his tongue, but he just didn't have enough information to grasp it. A small part of Lionel told him that had it not been for the vast increase in his computational power, the spark wouldn't have barely lit like this at all. This is actually so far beyond me. I need more information. Okay, I can see where you're coming from. It also makes sense that the cosmos is beyond natural light. But what is it about constellations? How could they be beyond the cosmos? You said yourself that stars are only different from planets in their mass, so how is an array of stars any different? Wise Star Order sighed. I think I preferred the silence more than I thought. I don't know what's so difficult to understand after I laid it all out. Lionel had already deduced the answer, but that wasn't the point. He had deduced it but his spark didn't light and finish its loop, so he still had no idea what his dreamscape was trying to tell him. The connection was still vague and sparking, but he just didn't have enough information. He was hoping that something Wise Star Order said could trigger the final jump. Just explain it. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Wise Star Order shook his head. For as long as life has existed, people have looked up at the skies. It didn't matter what stage of evolution they were at, reaching up was something everyone, regardless of race, gender, or culture, strove after. Whether it was the most primitive of races all the way up to the most advanced, they all looked up. In the infancy of a world, they marked out their gods in the skies. They told tales about what they represented and drew their figures, bowing to them in worship. As a world grew, those tales would grow and evolve, often becoming related to a person's sense of self. Regardless of the world, the prevalence of religion would fade, and right there to replace it would be a spirituality no race could seem to escape. Everyone wants to believe in something, even if it sometimes doesn't make sense to. Whenever people reach their end of their ropes, the stories in the skies would be there. A constellation is no longer about the stars that make them up, they represent something beyond that, the greatest of universal cycles, one that relied on a willingness to look up and go beyond. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. Lionel's brows furrowed hard, but it had nothing to do with wise Star Order's words. Those words were nice and poetic, old man. Unfortunately, they were absolutely useless. Lionel sighed, watching his dreamscape spark fade away. Chapter 1260. Weeks more went by before Lionel finally felt alright to swing himself out of bed. In retrospect, he probably should have had someone help him because he crashed onto the floor. Luckily, his migraine had receded and the pain in his body had become more of a dull soreness, or else he felt like he might have relapsed right then and there. At first, Lionel thought his muscles had atrophied. It was a pretty common symptom that happened to people that spent long amounts of time injured and bedridden. However, he found that conclusion to be weird, the main reason being because he wasn't a normal human. It had been about 2 months, yes, but this shouldn't have been enough to ruin him like this. Unless. Lionel felt a small panic cause his heart to skip a beat. His Scarlet Star Force innate node was now connected to a circuit around his body. Even though he wasn't actively using it, he wasn't actively restricting it anymore either. Could it be that his muscles were being eaten away by its properties? That day, Lionel had a quarter-life crisis staring at the luxury carpets of his hotel room. Considering his thinking speed, those few seconds would have felt like months to anyone else. Luckily, though, he managed to get a grip on himself. There were positives to this that he could take away. For one, he didn't feel any pain, which meant that even if his Scarlet Star Force was causing this, it was more than tolerable. Secondly, if his body was truly being eaten away at like this, if he fed it with enough nutrients and made up for its deficiencies, he might be able to grow some passive immunity. In that case, maybe the day he could use his own innate node freely would come. With these 2 pillars of support for his almost broken psyche, Lionel managed to pick himself up. But, that was when something he hadn't expected to happen, happened. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, Lionel had fallen to a single knee, so when he went to stand up, he was obviously pushing off of just one leg. He tried to test to see just how bad his muscle weakness had gotten, so he was measuring how much strength he had to push when he suddenly found himself flying sideways. Crash. The sprinkle of glass and the suddenness of open air hit Lionel before he was suddenly free-falling hundreds of meters. Many who had been outside the hotel at that moment looked up all at once to find a man falling through the skies in nothing more than his underwear. It definitely wasn't the sort of thing you saw every day. Lionel was so stunned that he didn't even react in time. Boom! An enormous dust cloud launched itself into the air, the earth rumbling as though a stone of unfathomable weight had suddenly been dropped onto it. Leo. Visit. For a better user experience, cap. A rush of people converged toward the hole on all sides. But, when the dust cleared, they only found a human-sized hole and a confused Lionel looking up into the skies as though he couldn't understand what had just happened. Shouldn't that have hurt? Lionel thought to himself. Lionel didn't get to finish this thought before the earth suddenly began to raise him up. He didn't need to guess to know that it was Raj who was acting. Son of a bitch, Cap. Why are you so heavy? Why are you asking about useless things? He could be dead. At that moment, a worried Aina came over as Milan's voice cried out to reprimand. In her presence, the boys seemed to become very obedient for some reason. Or, more accurately, reserved, as though they were in the presence of someone they greatly respected. Lionel, despite his absent-mindedness, immediately picked up on this. It was definitely something he found weird. His brothers had never reacted like this to Aina before. Though, now that he thought about it, they didn't really have many opportunities to interact to begin with. Raj ended up pulling Lionel up all the way out of the 5-meter deep hole, complaining to himself as he seemed to no longer dare to speak out loud. Visit. For a better user experience, when everyone got a good look at Lionel, they were rendered speechless. There wasn't even a single scratch on him. In fact, for some reason, the dirt didn't cling to his body at all. It was whisked away with the slightest of wind or fell of its own accord, leaving him completely spotless. It was as though Lionel's skin wasn't something they dared to blaspheme. I'm fine. I don't really know how this happened, honestly. One minute I was in the suite, and in the next I was falling through the skies. Lionel chuckled and tried to use the ground to pull himself up. But, at that moment, the location where his hand had been compressed, violent and raging cracks spreading out in all directions as the ground splintered as though an abyss had opened up beneath it. Lionel blinked. It might be best if you guys didn't touch me right now. An awkward silence fell over the group as they nodded slowly, taking a step back. That was just a casual pat to the ground, but Raj and the others had almost fallen flat on their faces. Only Aina seemed to have been able to keep her balance without trying very hard. Lionel's brow furrowed. He had thought his body had experienced atrophy, but this was clearly not the case. If this was atrophy, there wouldn't be any diseases in this world remaining. He wasn't even quite sure how to even go about doing normal things. This change was a bit too large, even his high-class coordination abilities didn't adjust immediately. It seems he would still need a few more days. Hey, Cap. About the shirt and pictures. You're not mad, right? Raj looked from the destroyed ground, to Lionel, and then back, laughing nervously. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience. Chapter 1261. Are you all sure? Lionel frowned as he gazed toward his brothers. With all they had been through in the dimensional verse, the term brother had really gone from something they called each other in jest to something they truly meant. So, Lionel couldn't help but feel a bitter taste in his mouth after he heard their decision. We're still a bit lacking like this, Leo. Joel nodded seriously. If we go to the Void Palace with you right now, we'll end up holding you back. And, if you really let us go free, I'm certain that more than one of us would die, and that's not something I want to see, and I'm sure you don't want to see it either. Lionel knew that Joel was right. In fact, Lionel would make certain that he never had to see it, and the result of that would be, unsurprisingly, them holding him back. Despite knowing this, Lionel didn't like it. He had neglected these brothers of his for too long, and he felt like he owed them far more than he had given them. They never asked for anything from him, but that didn't mean that he didn't want to give back. There's no need to make that face, Cap, Raj laughed. We'll still be mooching off of you. Grammy said she'd take care of us, and those Luxnick's old fogies don't dare to fart too loud around us anymore. Lionel smiled and shook his head. Couldn't this guy be serious for once? Still, Raj's words did make him feel a lot better. The environment on Earth was still good, but the Milky Way was simply far too lacking. If these guys had spent the past year on planet Luxnick's instead, Lionel had no doubt that their real talents would have shone through fiercely. Visit. For a better user experience, it seemed that he had overstepped by asking his mother to reserve spots for everyone. Eleanor had, of course, been willing to do it since Lionel had asked. But who would have thought that everyone would already have their own plans? Of his brothers, only the silent Arnold would be coming with Lionel. The rest chose to stay here and would find a later opportunity to join. For now, they would solidify their foundations, learn more about their abilities, and slowly push themselves to the quasi-sixth dimension. Plus, Leo, I'm sure there are a lot of things here that you'll want us to handle, right? Joel met Lionel's gaze unwaveringly. Lionel slowly nodded. He still needed to care for the Oryx and the remnants of the Milky Way Guild. In addition, he had moving pieces that were still setting themselves up with the Umbra family, not to mention the secrets related to the Midas and Radix. This wasn't something he had forgotten about, but while he was in the Void Palace, it would be difficult to police these matters. His own mother hadn't even been allowed to leave on her own whims, but she was a sector-ranked disciple. Logically, then, Lionel had no chance at moving freely after he entered their organization. Lionel had factored this into his plans already, and the reason he was okay with it was because there would surely be an exception made for when the Morales family heir wars were set to begin. That would be his chance to leave and ensure that his pawns had all promoted as they should. But, leaving things so hands-off for such a long period of time wasn't smart. It was especially a problem since his cousins-turned-competitors would definitely have their own men and women on the outside making moves for them. If Lionel didn't do the same, he would be handicapping himself. Thinking to this point, Lionel closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The latest _AP_SODIs are on the website. When he opened them once more, he had regained his focus. Alright, I will leave these matters to you. I'll find a method to establish communication with you all once I get to the Void Palace. Right. Joel grinned a rare smile. Lionel had one major flaw that maybe even he wasn't aware of: he was a control freak. If he could do something himself and not disrupt anyone else, he would rather do things that way. The day James betrayed them during the final game of the year, Lionel had realized what the problem was. Yet, instead of talking to anyone or even confronting James, he found a way to win the game by himself and preserve their friendship. When Lionel chose to show them his labs and the things he was working on, like the tentacle womb and others, they had already felt closer to him than they ever had before. But now, that feeling was even more potent. Lionel, Aina, Yuri, Savon, Carolus, Noah, Arnold, Elther. Visit. For a better user experience, these 8 would be the representatives of Earth that made their way to the Void Palace. This was maybe the first time in all of history that a fifth-dimensional world had actually produced so many entries. In fact, it was rare for a fifth-dimensional world to even stumble upon an entry to begin with, let alone have such a display. Of course, there were others that had made it as well. The Luxniks had the best showing, though this was unsurprising. After years of suppressing themselves, they had blossomed forth and gained many nominal ranked spots. Eloquin, Siller and Elodie all gained spots in addition to a few ranked disciples within the top 10, making the total reach 8 alone. Though Orinik felt that Lionel definitely didn't deserve the amethyst token, he could agree that there was no nepotism at play here. Of course, the 9th of the Luxniks was Miguel himself, who had, unsurprisingly, long since recovered. Among those unrelated to the Luxniks, though, there were only 4. One was a familiar young lady Lionel recognized, Raya Sage. The second was Higlis, the now heir to the Montex family, who was now in a very awkward position. And, the final 2 were both masked and exceptionally silent, but no one bothered them. However, at that moment, Aina, who hadn't spoken a word to Lionel in months, suddenly did so as though it was the most natural thing in the world. Visit. For a better user experience, King, I thought you should know about something that happened months ago. Lionel went from feeling like his bones were melting toward Aina calling him King, before he was suddenly enveloped by a flashbang of fury everyone but Aina and Miguel were forced to retreat from. He stretched out a hand and one of the masked men shot out, their throat landing in his palm as though it had always been there. Chapter 1262. Lionel would say that it had been a very long time since he had been this angry, but that would only be partially true. He was more enraged now than he had been with himself just a few months ago, and that was because this anger had nothing to do with him, but rather a very clear reverse scale of his mother. Lionel hadn't spent very long with his mother by his side, but those memories of affection he had with her as a child had been practically seared into his mind. Knowing that it wasn't her choice to leave his side only made these emotions easier to accept. The idea that someone would disrespect her left him infuriated to an extreme. The mask of the man that flew into Lionel's palm shattered, revealing the pale features and deep violet eyes of Richard. Of those here, maybe only a small percentage weren't surprised by this turn of events. It was unknown how this young man had managed to survive the ordeal of the Viola family, but none of that mattered now. Aina had been a part of Richard's schemes for a long while. Lionel never hid anything from her, so she was well aware that the Luxnix family was related to him. The trouble was that she didn't learn of what Richard had done until much later. Gradier's younger brother, Asen, had been caught by the Luxnix for daring to help in spreading the rumors. Aina's only task was to save him. But with her intelligence, it wasn't hard to piece together how these things were related. The Luxnix wouldn't just casually capture a member of the Viola family's main bloodline lineage without proper cause, especially when they were trying to lie low to begin with. When she saw the two masked figures, she was immediately suspicious. She had spent a long time with the Viola family and was well aware of how cunning Richard was. But, what was even more important was that Richard didn't gain this sort of character from himself. She simply didn't believe that the Viola family would have no contingency plans given a situation where they faced eradication. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience. Since she wasn't sure, though, she only chose to tell Lionel a summary of those events and did nothing to point out the two masked young men. But, as she had expected, Lionel had known from the very beginning that these two masked young men were none other than Richard and Gradier. It was just that he simply hadn't cared. Lionel had been able to assign the energy signatures on the billboard to the contestants from the very beginning. He just hadn't seen much of a reason to target Richard. From his perspective, the two of them had only had a clash in the dimensional cleanse trial zone, but there was no reason to hold a grudge, especially since he had won that exchange. But now, things were different. "You're responsible?" Lionel's hand squeezed down on Richard's neck. Any stronger and he might snap it in two. The latter tried to struggle and claw in Lionel's hand, but it felt like his nails were scratching against a metal plate. Not only did he not succeed, but he even ended up peeling his own nails back, resulting in a bloody mess that left his fingers mangled. The region fell into complete silence. Visit. For a better_user experience, the envoys of the Void Palace had been preparing the teleportation portal and Lionel's mother had been overseeing the progress. The region was the front gates of the Luxnix estate and there wasn't much of a crowd to begin with aside from a few close friends and family members. Orinik couldn't help but frown as the situation now was completely different than it had been in the past. Richard could be considered an official disciple of the Void Palace, albeit nominal. He couldn't just be casually killed because Lionel felt like it, even if Lionel had the amethyst token. Richard's face went completely blue. He couldn't answer Lionel even if he wanted to. For some reason, he felt like there was dimensional suppression between the two of them despite the fact they were both within the fifth. In fact, his tier was still higher than Lionel's own. He couldn't even begin to believe the feelings of fear he was experiencing, but the humiliation was worse. If he hadn't guessed by now that the man Aina had always been comparing him to was Lionel, he wouldn't have earned half the intelligence those around him believed him to have. To know that he had lost so handily to Lionel more times than he even knew was enough to infuriate him to an extreme. It only made it worse that the goddess he had been chasing for so long was rejected by the very man before him. And yet, by some horrible twist of fate, was still by his side like an obedient little wife. It had taken all the self-control in the world for him not to show his anger or leak any killing intent. He just wanted to put his head down and grasp this opportunity given to him by the Void Palace. Even though it is rare for nominal disciples to become true disciples, Richard didn't believe he would fail if he gave it everything he had. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, so, he buried his pride, his rage, his sadness to the deepest parts of his soul. But then in the greatest of ironies, it was the very woman who he had been chasing for so long that outed him in the end. He was under no illusion that he could be saved. He now knew who Lionel's mother was and it only made him feel even more foolish for what he had done. However, Richard didn't want to give up, not here, not now. He couldn't. His eyes rolled to the back of his head, their whites flashing as blood seeped out from between his teeth. The harder he struggled, the quicker he seemed to approach the gates of death. "Please show mercy." The voice came from none other than Gradier, the second masked man. Visit. For a better_user experience. Chapter 1263. When Lionel's gaze shifted to him, Gradier felt as though his mind was collapsing. It was just a single look, an indifferent glance, and yet it gripped at his soul, almost tearing it away from his body. The pressure was palpable to a degree that it almost manifested like tendrils of dark crimson in the air. Lionel didn't quite know who Gradier was, but Aina, who was still by his side, spoke a few simple words that made him understand what remained of the final pieces. It was then he understood that his mother's reputation had become collateral damage for an heir war maybe no different to what he might experience in a few years' time. Though, Lionel would soon find out that the scale of the Morales family heir wars couldn't be compared to these petty games in the slightest. It might very well reach the point of it embroiling the whole of the human domain. And, even if it didn't, it would most definitely grasp attention at least that far and wide. In truth, despite coming to understand things, Lionel didn't want to even give Richard a chance to live. He had never been very good at controlling his anger when it came to matters like this, and this certainly wasn't the first time he had flown into a rage for his mother's sake. Eleanor, though, being the madwoman that she was, simply sent a glance back as though she was witnessing the most adorable thing ever, even going to the point of dabbing at her eyes with a fresh handkerchief. Gradier could tell that Lionel had no intention of listening to him, so he stepped forward, removing his mask. I know that what my cousin has done is irredeemable, but he is one of the final hopes my Viola family has. I'm willing to exchange for his life. All of the most important treasures of the Viola family rest with us. I have heard of your Morales family from the envoys and know that your heir wars are coming very soon. What we have could be invaluable to you. I know that you could just kill us and take them, but if you did this you would find that they won't work as they should and end up becoming a detriment rather than a help to you. Visit. For a better user experience, Gradier spoke as fast as he could, hoping that Lionel would at least care enough to stay his hand for the moment. While Richard had been hosting the envoys and basking in his new position, Gradier had taken a completely different approach. Richard had said himself that he lost some of his sharpness after finally gaining the position he had fought for his whole life. It was to the point he had almost exposed himself to Patriarch Luxnix. However, Gradier, who had lost the very same position, was still looking forward and hoping to find a new way for himself to make an impact. So, when the envoys came to their family, while Richard had schemed to find a way to get Aina into his bed, Gradier was asking questions that would prepare him for the future, and that was when he learned the weight the Morales family held. Originally, Gradier simply wanted to understand the political landscape of the Void Palace and come to an understanding of who held the largest centers of power. Never would he have expected that the boy who had been stricken from the Luxnix family records was actually related to one of these behemoths. In truth, Gradier didn't actually know that Lionel was an heir candidate. He simply thought that even if he wasn't, a vast amount of resources would be valuable nonetheless. If the Morales heir wars worked like most did, then this wasn't just a jockeying of position for the heirs themselves, but also for their subordinates. Everyone who had backed Gradier found their lives to become 100 times harder all of a sudden, while it was the opposite for everyone who had followed Richard. Little did Gradier know that Lionel was indeed one of the heirs. Visit. For a better user experience, contrary to Gradier's expectations, though, Lionel didn't even waver when he heard such enticement. Why should I care? Lionel's hand squeezed down. Gradier's gaze flickered but eventually fell to despair. In their final plan, the Star Order Council equivalent of the Viola family had designed 2 spatial rings, one for Richard and the other for Gradier. Only by working together could they access 100% of the Viola family's legacy. It was a measure to ensure that the two of them would work together. What the Viola needed right now was stability, not infighting. Heir wars were a luxury of well-established families, something that they were decidedly not any longer. Toward this scene, the gazes of Orinik and the other envoys only became more awed and reserved. There was only so far that this nepotism should go. Allowing Lionel to kill a disciple was definitely way too far. It was hard to accept, but they also didn't dare to say anything either. But, who could have expected that it was while Richard was on the brink of death that Eleanor would suddenly appear to press a hand down on Lionel's forearm? Mom? Lionel frowned. Visit. For a better user experience, he wasn't quite familiar with the rules of the Void Palace just yet, so he was unaware that there was an issue. Though he probably should have guessed, he was too pissed to care enough to think about it. It's just a few words, what are you getting so angry about? Are you going to fight everyone that says something about me? Yes. Lionel replied without hesitation. Eleanor was stunned for a moment before she let off a light, airy laughter. While Lionel only saw his mother, the envoys, and the others had to pay very special attention not to stare for too long, lest they have even worse luck than Richard. After she finished laughing, Eleanor finally spoke once again. He isn't wrong, you may very well need what they have. But, Lionel's frown deepened. What could the Viola family have that he could possibly need? The Luxnick's treasure vaults should be far beyond them, and then there was still Wise Star Order's treasure deposits as well. Plus, even if he didn't have these things, he didn't like the idea of trading for forgiveness he didn't want to give. Visit. For the best no_vel_read_ng experience, trust me. Eleanor laughed and shook her head. It seemed the Void Palace would be gaining another Morales family troublemaker with the way things were trending now. Chapter 1264. The whoosh sound of a formed portal caught everyone's attention. It swirled about with a radiant dark violet and looked like a rotating nebula. Eleanor cast a glance and released her hold on Lionel's forearm. It seems it is time to go. Somewhat reluctantly, Lionel released his grip on Richard's throat. The latter fell to the ground heavily, coughing and wheezing. It took several moments for the color to return to his face and several more for his lightheadedness to vanish. Richard grit his teeth hard, but he restrained himself, relaxing his body in the next instant. If it wasn't for the somewhat vacant look in his eyes, one would have never guessed that something had happened. Well, that and the fact there was already a clear bruise in the shape of a hand around his throat. He rose from the ground slowly, but steadily. Follow me. Eleanor said lightly. The latest _AP_SODIes are on the website. There was a certain heaviness in Eleanor's tone right this moment. It wasn't because she feared for herself, but rather because she wasn't naive enough to believe that her actions would have no effect on her son. In fact, she was certain that it would be the direct opposite. As a mother, she couldn't help herself. Worrying was what she did. Even if her husband had been watching Lionel like a hawk right this moment, and even knowing the kind of strength he had, she would still be worrying. The Void Palace had its rules that protected disciples, but there were too many ways around them and they could only be enforced within its territory. Anne. Velasco had many enemies that had more than enough leeway to ignore these rules all on their own. Of course, whether they would dare to do so was a different matter entirely, but there were several more ways for them to make things difficult. They knew Val's personality well enough to know that they would get away with it too. While Eleanor looked like a reckless mother who had done as she pleased to save her son, the reality was that she had only gone so far because she needed to give her little lion every advantage he could get, because the truth was, he was already lagging far behind. The step through the portal was unlike anything Lionel had ever experienced before. It was far less subtle than his transportation to the dimensional cleanse trial world and felt a lot like his body was being stretched into a thin string, as though all his nerve centers had been shut down and his limbs were being pulled into a tight tube. Visit. For a better user experience when his vision cleared and he could finally feel his feet beneath him once again, the world around him was even more of a shock than the initial feeling. Lionel had thought that he had seen a lot of the dimensional verse already. Or, more accurately, his talks with Wise Star Order over the past few months had made it feel like his horizons had been broadened beyond the scope of even his previous imagination. However, the scene he saw before him now still took his breath away. There was no world, no planet, no moon. The Void Palace was just an enormous obsidian mountain range, floating in the depths of space and hanging upon a vast nothingness. The sheer size alone was impossible for a normal human to fathom. The distance from its base to its lowest peak was taller than the diameter of 3 planets stacked on top of one another, and its highest was more than 5. As for its width, it was as much as 10 planets wide. This alone was astonishing enough, enough that Lionel found it hard to wrap his brain around just how such a construct could even have been formed. But that was when his breath was taken away by the gates. The Paifang were even more glorious than the mountain range itself. Of course, this was partly due to the fact that the obsidian mountain that made up the Void Palace's territory seemed to be covered by a thin veil of protection, stopping Lionel from observing it as deeply as he wanted. Author's note: a Paifang is a Chinese-style gate/archway. Visit. For the best know_vel_read_ng experience, they towered for thousands kilometers, the centerpiece of each one of their archways containing what looked like a miniature blazing white star, providing the only sort of contrast to the endless blackness in the surroundings. While the mountain range seemed an almost infinite distance away, the Paifang were close, almost too close. They bore down with a haunting momentum that made the valiant heart pillars Lionel had experienced before seem like nothing more than child's play. It felt like these gates were the linchpin that kept everything in place. They protected the Void Palace despite not having doorways and acted as passageways simultaneously. It was only then the shocking question hit Lionel like a ton of bricks. The mountain was over there, and the gates were there, but they all hung in a vast and empty space. So, what the hell was he standing on? Lionel looked down, his pupils constricting when he realized that he wasn't standing on anything at all. There was nothing between him and an endless abyss. Usually, this wouldn't be a big deal. After all, in space like this, there shouldn't have been a need to worry about gravity inevitably leading him to a crushing death. But he could very clearly tell which way was up and which way was down in this place. Just what was going on. Visit. For the best know_vel_read_ng experience before Lionel could think about it any further, the closest Paifang word to life, the shadow of several figures stepping outward. Lionel couldn't seem to see through any one of them, but he could tell that each one was unfathomable. Orinik and the other envoys seemed to be snapped awake right that moment, hurriedly bowing in greeting. However, these figures didn't spare them a single glance as a woman at the center of them all frowned deeply, her gaze having been locked onto Alienor the entire time. What is the meaning of this, Alienor? Your sector is several months late. Chapter 1265. There were 3 individuals who stepped out, all dressed in elaborate robes wrapped in violet, blacks, and silvers. It seemed to paint the picture of swirling a nebula and was most definitely a beautiful contrast in colors and construction. It took no more than this for Lionel's cool uniform senses to tingle once again. He had already forgotten the weight of the conversation, looking them up and down as though he could already envision himself wearing it. For someone who didn't care about how he dressed much, Lionel was very much obsessed with how well the organizations he joined did in this fashion. But maybe only he was aware of the reason why this was. Late? Alienor asked lightly. Her demeanor seemed to have completely shifted. There was nothing left of a loving mother and there was only a calm indifference left. The pressure she exuded multiplied several times over, causing the brows of the woman who had stepped forward to furrow. Of the 3 that had appeared, all of them were sector-ranked disciples and were, as such, well acquainted with one another. The young woman who spoke was maybe the most powerful of the 3 and as such had spoken on their behalf. But, even though her words were laced with an impatience and hardly concealed anger, if it was contrasted with how furious she had been earlier, it would be obvious to anyone that she was being reserved right this moment and only became more so after Alienor had spoken. The last group before yours arrived over a month and a half ago. What possible explanation could you have for delaying us all for so long? Visit. For the best know_vel_read_ng experience, Lionel had originally been paying attention to the subtleties of the conversation. He could see that power dynamic here and it was quite clear that his mother was a step above. It seemed that even though she couldn't be as rampant as Velasco, she had her own small hegemon. However, Lionel's attention was soon pulled away by something else. Orinik and the other envoys who had stepped forward to bow in respect were a bit off. It took Lionel a moment, but he realized that they were actually still trying to adjust to the long-scale teleportation. When he noticed this, his attention shifted once again to those around him and he noticed that even Aina and Miguel still had a deep frown marring their foreheads, their eyes tightly closed and their bodies trembling somewhat. It looked as though they still felt like they were teleporting. Lionel would soon realize, though, that this conclusion of his was wrong. Yip! Yip! At that moment, little Black Star shot out from Lionel's spatial ring, catching him off guard. Little Black Star appeared and vanished whenever the little guy felt like it, but he rarely appeared in situations where Lionel wasn't alone, at least not so suddenly. The little guy excitedly jumped around, appearing and vanishing as he pleased. When he flashed back to Lionel's head or hair, he didn't seem ready to rest and still continued to hop around. Visit. For a better user experience, yip. Yip. Lionel smiled. Alright. I get it, you're excited. Yip. Yip. The expression of the woman darkened before it suddenly flashed with a hint of surprise. She realized that by Lionel's style of dress that he wasn't yet a disciple but he had recovered already. And that little creature. Adjusting to this place was more than just about the teleportation over. It would make sense for little Black Star to be fine as he hadn't had to take the brunt of the travel over. However, not only was this region a seventh-dimensional world that sat at the very pinnacle, far beyond what most had ever experienced, there was also a dense concentration of anarchic force in the general surroundings that made it feel as though you were breathing in poison constantly. Of course, this dense concentration was only a few parts per billion. But, this concentration was already enough to make a person feel greatly uncomfortable. The fact Lionel had already adjusted made little sense. Void Palace was designed this way on purpose. Even though they had the technology to make the density of anarchic force negligible, it was best to get the disciples accustomed to this right now. This would only get worse on the void battlefield. But how was this tiny, insignificant creature doing just fine? Visit. For a better user experience, Alienor seemed not to have heard her son's outburst at all. Instead, she replied just as evenly as she originally did. What do their earlier rivals have to do with me? There is no deadline and every selection is left up to the discretion of the overseer. Mine just happened to take longer. The woman snapped her attention back to Alienor when she heard this. Her expression couldn't help but twitch. What Alienor said was true, but this all had to be within reason. This was taking things to an extreme, especially since several exceptions had been made already. However, when the woman thought about how all the other youths had had months to adjust to this environment while Alienor's group wouldn't have this luxury, her mind shifted toward an internal sneer. Your words are just as fault-proof as they always are, Lady Alienor. But, I still must inform you that the higher-ups aren't satisfied with how this selection has lagged behind the others in schedule. It's been decided that your sector will only be given 3 hours to adjust upon arrival. Following this grace period, the true selection will start immediately. I will be overseeing a large portion of these matters, so I will not allow any delay. Despite having expected such an outcome, Alienor still frowned deeply, much to the satisfaction of Asenna. 3 hours was definitely excessively short. She had hoped that they would receive at least a day. Clearly, those old fogies were throwing their weight around. At that moment, though, a flash of violet caught Alienor's attention out of the corner of her eye. She looked over to find her son twirling the heavy amethyst token as though it weighed as light as a feather, dancing it between his fingers with a deft skill only possible by someone with an impossibly high-grade designation. Visit. For a better user experience, the token flipped in the air and a satisfying slap was heard as Lionel caught it again. His gaze twinkled as his mind drifted to the moment Aina had handed it to him. Then, he smiled confidently. Leave it to me, Mom. You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.